This Honorable Superior Court for the County of Wake is now convened and sitting for the regular dispatch business. The Honorable Judges Alma Hitt, Paul C. Ridgway, Joe Crosswhite, President presiding. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, God save the state. This Honorable Court, please be seated, remain quiet. All electronic devices should be off at this time. Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, sir. Thank you. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We'll proceed with Dr. Cooper to resume his seat. All right, that's fine. Let's go ahead and deal with that.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just an update, or several updates. If you recall these demonstratives from Dr. Chen that there was some
Yes, sir.
Discussion about last night, as the court directed, we sent the defendants all of the backup materials, including the code. In preparing and packaging up the code, Dr. Chen realized that in just I can explain it, but just on the red and blue map in one of these, essentially there was a speck of land that was shaded red that should have been shaded white. It doesn't implicate or relate to his testimony in any way, because that speck of land is not land that the special master touched or that his simulations touched. And essentially the same issue on both D5 and D6, just for that one map that's red and blue. The other ones are unchanged. So we sent the defendants the updated versions last night. I've also brought updated copies for the court, just to make sure the court had the full and accurate copies, if I may approach and hand it to you.
Yes, please. And I assume you've shown the defendants the
Spec.
The spec.
Yes.
All right. Very good.
There's 3 copies in here.
All right. That's fine.
That's 6.
All right. Thank you, sir. Any other matters that we need to take up?
One very briefly. So in terms of the timing, this morning we'll finish Dr. Cooper's testimony. Our next witness will be Dr. Jonathan Mattingly from Duke. He has a flight to Austria that he's trying to catch. I can't recall if it's later tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. It might be tonight. But depending on how things are going, we may ask the court's indulgence if it would be possible to either shorten lunch to an hour or possibly extend a little bit beyond 5, preferably the former. Obviously, you know, it's the court's decision, but if possible, we'd prefer not to have Dr. Mattingly stay over the weekend just to finish a half hour or less of testimony on Monday morning.
I can tell you that I don't believe we can stay past 5 due to prior commitments of the court. I think we can certainly confer at the first break that a shorter lunch break is something that would be preferable. So we'll try to do what we can to accommodate you.
Thank you.
Any matters for the defense, intervenings, or the state that we need to take up before we proceed? All right, very good. Then let's have Dr. Cooper resume his seat. Questions for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Cooper. Where we left off yesterday, we were beginning to talk about the map files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive that you reviewed and inspected as part of your work in this case, right?
That's correct.
And I believe we left off with the conclusion that you were able to arrive at after inspecting the map files that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about today. But that conclusion was that, in your opinion, the chief architect of North Carolina's state legislative maps had access to partisan data, had partisan data active and alive, and was clearly working with partisan data on the same maps at the same time as he was drawing the district boundaries that we're talking about in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And we were beginning to talk about the first, or one of the screenshots of the one of Dr. Hoffler's map files. And you were beginning to describe that for us. So just to reorient everybody this morning, let's go back to Plaintiff's Exhibit 332. And I know yesterday you told us that within this screenshot of one of Dr. Hoffler,
Need to figure out why the large monitor is not displaying.
oh, I apologize.
Is it working? Speak loud.
Great, so it looks like we're back up, and Dr. Cooper, you can see on the big screen in front of you,
Yes.
Dr. Hoffler's map file, or a screenshot from that map file. And yesterday you told us that this is a map file titled NC Senate J24. Is that correct?
That's correct. You can see that in the top of the screen. Again, you've got the, I guess, menu bars at the top, the shortcuts, and then right there at the top, NC Senate J24.map.
And this is one of the map files, one of Dr. Hoffler's map files that you inspected as part of your work in this case.
That's correct.
And you talked about the partisan formula that he used, he created, and then displayed on the screen in his map files. But can you tell us again what the color coding is that we're looking at here in relation to that partisan formula that you talked about yesterday?
Sure. So yesterday we looked at the partisan formula, which is essentially the Republican vote share over a number of elections, or average Republican vote share over a number of elections. And you can see the sort of counterintuitively in some ways, the red is actually the more Democratic. And so that would be a geographic unit that voted between 0 and 35% for the Republican candidate on the pink there at the top. And then at the sort of dark green on the bottom would be 65 to 100 for the Republican candidate. This is, talked about this the other day just to help me keep it straight in my own brain. I tend to think of this like a traffic light. You've got your red is Democratic districts, sort of stop if you're drawing these lines. Green is go. Green are the very Republican places, and yellow is the geographic units in the middle. This is sort of your pause. You can also see the purple are the outlines of the districts, and I probably should have mentioned that yesterday in more detail. So you can see the district lines that he was working with, and you can see the color-coded geographic units behind that.
And just so it's absolutely clear, the partisan formula that you were talking about, which is displayed in the colors, this traffic light that you're describing for us, that was something that Dr. Hoffler had to create in the map file himself.
That's correct.
In other words, that didn't appear automatically.
I don't know how it would. No, it did not appear automatically.
Okay. So you mentioned that you can see the boundaries of the districts as Dr. Hoffler was drawing them in the map file with the purple lines. There's also some gray, small gray boxes on the screen. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us what those gray boxes are representing?
Sure. Those are the district numbers that he was working with at the time.
And these were the district numbers, sort of the provisional district numbers in his maps as he was tinkering with the boundaries at this point.
That's correct.
So they don't necessarily, as we heard yesterday from Dr. Chen's testimony, they don't necessarily correspond in all cases with the final district number.
They do not in all cases.
Even though the boundaries, as you were able to observe them, are relatively, if not exactly the same as the final district boundaries you looked at in this case.
That's correct.
Okay. So yesterday you were telling us that this shows Senate districts 10, 11, and 12, along with the traffic light color coding. It's a little bit difficult at first glance to make out, just because I think we're looking at more than those Senate districts in this map. But as best you can you sort of outline for us the areas or the boundaries that show us these 3 Senate districts that you're discussing?
Sure. So probably the easiest thing to focus on is 11, which is, let's see here, right quarter over the top of the screen, and you can see, so this is roughly, is my thing working?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, all right. Oh, shoot, sorry. Here's roughly, sorry, just so you know, it doesn't look that way on my screen. So that's roughly Senate District 11, and you can see Rocky Mount sort of at the north, and you can see that connecting down. So you can see very clearly the differences in the color coding for each of these geographic units.
And just so the record's clear, Dr. Cooper, you've circled an area that sort of starts in the middle of the screenshot where there's some red, pink, and the circle extends down into the center of the screenshot, goes around some yellow and red VTDs in the middle of the screenshot, circles back up.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's Senate District 11.
That's correct.
And then can you show us where Senate Districts 12 and 10 are in relation to that?
Sure, let me see. So Senate District 12, you can see circled right here, and Senate District 10, you can see here.
Okay, and I won't try to describe all the way these lines twist and turn, but you can see from the gray boxes that have the district numbers where these two Senate districts lie. And if you look at the purple boundaries outside of them, that shows you the district boundaries for Senate Districts 10 and 12 that you were just describing.
That's correct.
Okay. So you were starting to talk about this yesterday, but what is this screenshot of Dr. Hoffler's map file, particularly in the way that it's representing the color coding that he's employed to measure partisanship in these three Senate districts? What does that show you about Dr. Hoffler's process and the creation of these maps in this case?
I think it shows that partisanship was front and center when he was drawing these lines. At the very least, he had knowledge of the partisan implications of this, down to very small geographic units. And I think it's safe to say that he would have understood the partisan consequences of small decisions. Again, whenever there's discretion, what are the partisan implications of the way that discretion is exercised?
And Dr. Cooper, if I could direct your attention to the middle of this screenshot, just within the boundaries really of that red circle that you've drawn for us, in Senate District 11, we see some green, but in the middle of that, some yellowish, pink, and red shaded BTDs.
Yes.
So that's along the boundaries, it looks to be, of Senate District 11 and Senate District 10. Is that right?
That's correct. And you can see the really remarkable precision with which these lines are drawn. You can see, with the naked eye, what Dr. Hoffler was looking at, what information he had available to him, what he was able to see.
And what in particular does that show you, those particular VTDs along that district boundary that we just called out?
Yeah, so you can see very clearly the green just above, and you can see the yellow just below. You can also see the red, you can see the green just above. So essentially you're building a fence essentially between Democratic and Republican voters.
And I think you mentioned this yesterday, but on the other side of Senate District 11, you have some red and pink pockets.
That's correct.
And that was in the Rocky Mount area?
That's correct.
And
so those are the Democratic-leaning geographic units.
And if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Cooper, could you clear the red circles that you've already drawn?
I would like to do that, Mr. Sella.
And I ask you to do that without having any idea how you actually do that myself, but
I'm hitting
hopefully we
the
can
button
help you
that I
figure it out.
understood to do that.
Weird.
Okay.
It's coming here, it's not there.
Okay. I think I'm gonna.
So it looks like now we're back to the screenshot as you saw it, as it was on Dr. Hoffler's computer screen. And to come back to what we were just talking
Sure.
about, the red and pink VTDs in the Rocky Mount area, would you mind just indicating for the court where that is on this map?
Sure. Thank you. we're at the red and the pink areas right at the top, at the northern part of this cluster.
If we could, just to make this screenshot of Dr. Hoffler's map a little bit clearer, could we do a split screen with Plaintiff's Exhibit 274. So Dr. Cooper, now we have side by side Dr. Hoffler's map file and the traffic light color coding for partisanship and VTDs within Senate Districts 10, 11, and 12. And on the right side, we have the maps you were talking about yesterday that you used as part of your original expert analysis in this case to measure the partisan implications of the boundaries as they exist, as they were enacted. And looking at these two maps, can you tell us what Dr. Hoffler was looking at compares to your analysis here?
Sure. So again, I think the easiest thing to do is probably just to look at District 11. You can see Rocky Mount. You see the blue on the right-hand side of the map that I had in my expert report, and you can see how that correlates to the red. Again, you got to keep that straight in your brain. That's the red part of Dr. Hoffler's map in the exact same area. You can then see the district takes similar jogs. The red on my map then corresponds to the green, meaning go, on his map.
And coming back to that border between Senate District 11 and Senate District 10 that you were speaking about a moment ago, on Dr. Hoffler's map, that's the yellow, red, pink, sort of in the center of the screen. Can you compare that to what you were looking at on the map on the right side?
Sure. Yeah, again, this is very similar. Just keep the differences in the color coding in mind. Red means something opposite on either map, but you can see very clearly, again, this sort of surgical precision that's drawn on the left-hand map, you can see represented almost perfectly on the right-hand map that is the enacted map.
And actually, Dr. Hoffler's formula, as you mentioned, his partisanship formula was slightly different than yours. But it appears here that actually the partisan implications of this particular boundary and the VTDs alongside it are even clearer in the map that Dr. Hoffler is working on.
That's correct. They're very similar, and a lot of they're correlated very highly. But his map clearly indicates the partisan implications, as anybody can see, of drawing the lines exactly where they're drawn.
So in your map on the right side, that white shaded area, that's the yellowish area along the same border of Senate Districts 11 and 10 in Dr. Hoffler's map.
That's right. So the yellow in his map corresponds roughly to the white in my map on the right side.
And again, the white in your map, that means that the vote share between the two parties is closer to 50-50.
Normalized by acre, yes.
Okay. So Dr. Cooper, let's move on to another piece of Dr. Hoffler's map file that you inspected. Could we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 334? And so again, Dr. Cooper, is this a screenshot from the NC Senate J24 map file on Dr. Hoffler's hard drive that you were inspecting?
It is, as you can see in blue right there at the top.
Okay. And like all the others we'll be talking about today, this is a screenshot that you were able to personally observe. What's on the screen here is what you were able to personally observe as you were looking at this map file.
That's correct.
And you didn't do anything to alter that map file in any way before taking the screenshot?
I did not.
Okay. So can you tell us, Dr. Cooper, what we're looking at here in this color-coded map of Dr. Hoffler's?
Sure. So this is Senate Districts 24, 26, 27, and 28, centered around Guilford County. And I think you can see very clearly what stands out to anybody looking at this, I think, is going to be the pink area in the middle. And keep in mind, pink here and red is actually Democratic. And you can see the way I guess on the sort of northwest-ish, cutting through the middle of Greensboro, you can see the separation of this sort of fence between Democratic voters and Republican voters. Again, these green, the Republican VTDs colored and separated from the pink Democratic-leaning VTDs and the red ones.
And I know we've already heard some testimony, and you've spoken about this high point area in these particular Senate districts. Can you see that on this map from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we talked about this. There needs to be a county traversal somewhere here. That by itself is not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. The question is, where does that county traversal take place, right? Which VTDs do you grab and put in this district just below, okay? And I think as we looked at with my maps, you can see that the VTDs that were chosen, the adjacent VTDs, were different essentially than any other VTD in one way in particular, which was they contain Democratic voters. And you can see in Dr. Hoffler's map, he drew that line with that full intention of that partisan consequence.
So if we could just zoom back out to see the full screenshot again. If you look at where Randolph County is and the VTDs to its north that you might include in that Randolph County-based Senate district, looks here like Dr. Hoffler has selected the most Democratic of those VTDs. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So we see Randolph County to the south, and then we can see where you're going to, again, you're going to have a county traversal. The question is, where do you have that county traversal? And does that traversal have partisan consequences as opposed to the other decisions that could have been made? In other words, when he is exercising discretion, does the discretion consistently move in the favor of one party at the expense of the other? And here I think we're seeing clearly not only that happened, but that he had knowledge of it. He had this data available. He had this data active. Presumably, he knew these consequences.
And even within that high point area that he's drawing the district boundary around, it's with almost surgical precision the way it follows the pink and red VTDs that lean more Democratic.
No, absolutely. It looks, I mean, it's kind of a work of art, the way that it runs around the northern part of High Point and which VTDs it includes and which ones it does not.
So yesterday you mentioned that when you open up the map files that you inspected from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive, you see part of the map of North Carolina that he was working on, but not everything all on the screen at one time. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you happen to recall, though, whether this was what you could see when you first opened up the map?
Yes, this or something extremely close to this. There might have been moved over an eighth of an inch in some place, but essentially this is the area of our state that came up and was immediately recognizable when this file was last saved.
And in particular, these Senate districts, 24, 26, 27, and 28, those were visible when the file was first opened from
Yes.
Dr. Hoffler's hard drive?
Yes, those were all visible.
So this was the last thing that he was looking at when he closed that file?
Yes, when he closed the J24 map file.
So let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 335. And Dr. Cooper, here we have again the same traffic light color coding for partisanship, but could you help orient us a little bit to what we're looking at here, which appears to be contain the area of Senate Districts 31 and 32 as they were enacted?
Yes, that's correct. So this is, we're centered right around Winston-Salem here.
Okay. And what is this traffic light color coding for partisanship in these VTDs, particularly around Winston-Salem? What does that show you about Dr. Hoffler's work on the map in this case?
Sure. So you may recall from when we talked about the maps in my report before, this kind of bite mark that comes out of Winston-Salem over on the west side. And you can see that illustrated really clearly in Dr. Hoffler's map. You can see this green area on the west side, and you can see the purple that follows that border almost perfectly. You can also see that it juts in, grabs Winston-Salem, then goes to the west a little, goes north, and then essentially runs all the way around the city.
So with this traffic light and the red, yellow, green, sort of that bite mark, it's go, 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 but when you get into the red VTDs of Winston-Salem, stop. Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 336. So, Dr. Cooper, Plaintiff Exhibit 336, tell us what we're looking at here.
Sure. So this is Mecklenburg County.
And what does the color coding, this traffic light color coding, show you about Dr. Hoffler's use of partisan data in drawing the district boundaries in Mecklenburg County?
So again, keeping in mind the differences in the color coding here, that's not red-blue in the way we tend to think of it. You can see what I described as this pizza slice coming out of the city before. You can see is now green, which makes sense. You can also see this District 41 here, which is running from the south side of Charlotte, remember, through that narrow passageway, that quarry, back up the west side of town, connecting all the way to the north, connecting these Republican or Go Green VTDs in the south side with those in the north side. You can also see clearly 39 is made as competitive as possible for Republicans, and you can see the packing that exists in the remaining districts.
This pizza slice, as you're describing it, we saw a version of that on your maps that you used in your original expert report that you testified about yesterday. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in your maps, since you color-coded Republican VTDs as red, that was a red pizza slice.
That's right.
Here, that same pizza slice in that Senate district on the southeast side of Mecklenburg County, that includes a green pizza slice.
That's right. We're going vegetarian here.
All right, so Dr. Cooper, we've been talking about your inspection and some screenshots of Dr. Hoffler's North Carolina Senate District maps, and in particular, the map file he had on his hard drive titled NC Senate J24. Did you inspect any of Dr. Hoffler's map files for the 2017 House District that he was drawing?
I did.
So could we go to Plaintiff's Exhibit 337? So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 337?
This is the partisan formula field that he had for the 2017 House redistricting.
Okay. And can you tell from looking at this what the title of the file was that you were inspecting in this screenshot?
Will, and I should have mentioned, yeah, this is a screenshot of that. So it's the NC House J-25.map.
And I think you mentioned that it shows us the partisan formula field. Is that similar to what you saw with the North Carolina Senate map we spoke about earlier?
It is essentially average Republican vote share over a number of elections.
Now there's that same color coding key on the left-hand side of this screenshot, but it looks a little bit different than what we looked at with the North Carolina Senate maps. So could you describe what that color coding key represents in this particular map file that Dr. Hoffler was working on?
Sure. This one is going to be more familiar to most people. Here, the red are the Republican VTDs, the blue are the Democratic VTDs. So I'll just grab a couple of these, starting at the bottom there. That's the dark blue would be between 0 and 30% average Republican vote share. The lighter blue one would be between 30 and 35% average Republican vote share, and on up.
So the most Republican VTDs were shown on Dr. Hoffler's map file here as being being red or orange. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the most Democratic ones were these two shades of blue at the top of the key that you've just pointed us to.
That's correct.
And then as you get towards the middle, where it's closer to an even split of the two-party vote, the VTDs are represented by sort of shades of green on his map.
Yes.
Okay. Did you inspect any metadata for this North Carolina House J25 map file that Dr. Hoffler was working on?
Yes.
Okay, can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 562? And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 562?
This is the properties field from the J25 map file. So I think we talked about a similar version of this yesterday. So think about this like you would think of properties in any other software package you're familiar with. So here we see the plan type is State House. We see that it was created June 25th, 2017, 1630, and it was last modified August 7th, 2017. Looks like he was working late that night, about 11 o'clock. And I think Dr. Chin talked in a lot of detail that I'll spare the court about the comments field and the lineage of those files and how that works.
So let's talk about one of your screenshots of Dr. Hoffler's North Carolina house map file for 2017. Could we move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 340? So Dr. Cooper, in Plaintiff's Exhibit 340, it looks like we're looking at an area of North Carolina that includes House Districts 8, 9, and 12. But could you help orient us to what we're looking at with the color coding for partisanship that we can see in Dr. Hoffler's map file here?
Sure. This is, as you said, House Districts 8, 9, and 12. This is in Pitt and Lenoir counties. And you can see very similarly to what you saw in the map that we saw in the map that was in my expert report. The current map packs these Democratic areas of Pitt County into 8, creating a strong Democratic district, but allowing 9 and 10 to have a greater chance of electing Republicans.
One thing I'll note just for the record, in the Senate maps we looked at, the boundaries of the districts was colored purple. It appears here in these North Carolina House maps from 2017, the boundaries are in red. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
But we can still see in the little gray boxes the House district numbers as Dr. Hoffler was working on the boundaries.
That's correct. And you can see, again, the specific jogs that these district lines are taking. You can see the shapes perfectly represented. And you recall that this looks strikingly similar to the ones that I showed yesterday.
Okay. And just to make that clear, could we do a split screen with Plaintiff's Exhibit 294 from your expert report? So Dr. Cooper, we're looking at, on the right side, the map that you created in your expert report and that you analyzed in your expert report showing House Districts 8, 9, and 12 alongside Dr. Hoffler's map as he was drawing those districts. Can you show us, compare the two maps in any areas that might be relevant as part of your analysis here?
Yeah, so I think the Greenville split, which we talked about a good bit yesterday, we talked about the split of ECU, where the Trump rally is in a different district than the library. You can see that same jog happens in both. So the sort of jut out to the east side, right where Greenville is, you can see it in Dr. Hoffler's map. You can also see it in the map from my report here. You can also see Lenoir right in my map where it's, the blue that's right under the 12. You can see the very same area represented very clearly in Dr. Hoffler's map on the left.
And I'm hoping this isn't too complicated to do, but is it possible to zoom in on both the left-hand side of the screen to show the dark blue areas towards the top center of the map? And then could we zoom in on the right side, the same blue areas? So Dr. Cooper, is this what you were describing a moment ago?
This is this jog right at ECU, right in Greenville.
Okay, and these are the lines that Dr. Hoffler drew with the surgical precision that you're talking about around these Democratic-leaning VTDs.
That's right. So if you see on the map that I had yesterday on the right, you can see the red VTDs represented just on the east side of that line, and you can see he had full knowledge of the partisan effects of that on the left side.
And Dr. Cooper, just so it's absolutely clear in the record, the blue color coding on Dr. Hoffler's map, that represents Democratic-leaning VTDs, just as the blue color coding on your map on the right side of the screen, that represents Democratic-leaning VTDs.
That's correct.
And similarly, the red shading in Dr. Hoffler's map corresponds to Republican VTDs, just as the red shading in your map corresponds to Republican VTDs.
That's correct. And you can see that clearly. Just look at the two red VTDs just on the south and east side where it says Greenville just below there, and you can see those two almost like legs coming down on the left side as well.
The green and the yellow, they're the closer in terms of two-party vote share in Dr. Hoffler's map, and in your map, they're closer to a shade of white.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 342. And Dr. Cooper, this looks to be, from the title, a screenshot of part of Dr. Hoffler's map that includes the boundaries of House Districts 16, 46, and 47. But can you help orient us to what we're looking at here and how the color coding, Dr. Hoffler's color coding for partisanship, relates to your analysis?
Sure. So you can see, as was just circled, each of the district numbers circled. So you can see the 16 just above Rocky Point. You can see the 46 over to the west, and you can see the 47 farther west. You see the node of Pembroke right there, and you can see very clearly the packing in 47. You can see that Dr. Hoffler had full knowledge of the partisan effects of drawing those lines exactly where they were drawn, essentially drawing a fence between districts 47 and 46, or a fence in this case between Democratic and Republican voters, packing these Democratic voters into 47, leaving 46 to be much more competitive for Republicans.
And on this boundary that you're talking about with the District 47's line there, we can see on the right-hand side, or I should say the eastern side of that boundary, an orange shaded VTD on the other side of the district line. So that would be a Republican-leaning, more Republican-leaning VTD on Dr. Hoffler's map.
That's correct.
Okay, and that was drawn out of that particular district, whereas the blue VTDs, the Democratic-leaning VTDs, Dr. Hoffler drew them into, or packed them into, House District 47.
That's correct.
Let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 344. And Dr. Cooper, tell us what we're looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 344.
Sure. This is Guilford County, and you can see very clearly he's got his district numbers again represented in the gray boxes. You can see the city of Greensboro represented very clearly, and you can also see this kind of C shape, or backwards C shape, I guess, that we talked about before, where he has labeled 62 running on the north, of course, to the east, and then back all the way to the south side of the county. You can also see High Point represented very clearly, and the Democratic-leaning VTDs there connecting to the district below.
Just so it's absolutely clear, we're looking at color shading based on partisanship again, and these are the more familiar red and blue color shadings, red corresponding to Republican-leaning VTDs and blue corresponding to Democratic-leaning VTDs.
That's right. We can forget the traffic light for a minute and just go back to what we're used to. Red or Republican, blue or Democratic.
That was the color scheme Dr. Hoffler was working with and looking at on this map file.
That's correct.
So could we zoom in towards really the bottom half of this image, but the full bottom half, so we can see both the southern boundaries of the sort of the blue pack BTDs and the red lines, particularly that High Point area as well. So could you show us how the red district boundaries for these House districts that we're looking at here, how they seem to come around the blue shaded BTDs that we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to, and luckily it's pretty clear. So if you just start on the southern border of Guilford County, that's right where your line is, that's perfect. And then just to the right, again, almost like a fence, you can see each one up to the east in this case, each one of these Republican-leaning, or in this case, really Republican stronghold VTDs. And you can see it snake its way up and over, I don't know, comes around Italy there for a while maybe, and then comes back up, and then seems to go right. So you can see a very clear fencing of the Republican voters, separating them from the Democratic voters.
Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 345. And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 345?
This is Forsyth and Yadkin counties.
And here we see the more familiar red color coding for Republican VTDs, blue color coding for Democratic-leaning VTDs that Dr. Hoffler was working with in this map file. But can you tell us about how that color coding relates to your analysis that you've shared with us already?
Sure. So the easiest thing to do, and what everybody probably is doing, is to focus on Winston-Salem and to try to see how Winston-Salem is split. And again, splitting Winston-Salem is something that had to happen. The question is, when there is discretion to be exercised, how was Winston-Salem split? How many ways? And was it to the benefit of one party at the expense of the other party? And I think you can see very clearly in Dr. Hoffler's map with the red outlines of the districts just how the anatomy of this gerrymander works. You can see the packing that occurs, and then you can see the effects of that packing, which is to make the other districts much more competitive for Republican voters.
So staying with Winston-Salem, it looks like there's 2 House districts here that include almost all of the Democratic-leaning VTDs, as shown by the blue color coding within them. 2 House districts in that area. And I think I can see it's House District 72 on the north side of Winston-Salem. And there's not a label below for the second House district, but that would be what became House District 71 as enacted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And those are the 2 House districts you're talking about where this packing of Democratic voters occurred as Dr. Hoffler was working with the map file.
Exactly. So if you just visually inspect those boundaries and what's within those boundaries, you don't see any red, you don't see any pink, you don't see any Republican-leaning VTDs. You can also, again, just follow the jogs of those lines.
Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 346. And this looks to be another screenshot from this NC House map file that you inspected from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive. Can recognize the pizza slice, I think, already, but tell us what we're looking at here, Dr. Cooper.
Sure. So this is the Mecklenburg County cluster, and we're seeing, I mean, really it's a very similar story to the story we outlined yesterday when I described the maps in my report. You can see this pizza slice coming from the south side, again, jutting into the middle, essentially, of Charlotte. You can also see the packing that occurred elsewhere in and around the city. And you can see, you know, what became the very lines we have today that, again, move the scale slightly towards the Republican Party and away from the Democratic Party.
And again, just so it's clear in the record, the red pizza slice and the other VTDs we see here, those correspond to VTDs that are Republican leaning, and the blue VTDs that you talked about being packed into the other House districts, those correspond to VTDs that are Democratic leaning.
That's correct.
Okay. So, Dr. Cooper, we've been looking at screenshots of Dr. Hoffler's map files you inspected that related to both the 2017 Senate redistricting and the 2017 House redistricting, and the lines that Dr. Hoffler drew for those districts in 2017. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to look at any of Dr. Hoffler's map files from the lines he drew in the 2011 redistricting?
I was.
Okay. Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 347. So, Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 347?
Sure. This is his partisan formula field from the 2011 NC Senate redistricting. Again, it's a screenshot of that taken from his hard drive. You can see the title, NC Senate Master, July 11th, 0115.map. And here his partisan formula is a little different. So in 2017, his partisan formula is an average across a number of elections, as we've talked about, average Republican vote share. This one is simpler. This is simply the percentage of the vote for John McCain by each geographic unit. Okay, so you can see the R standing for Republican, of course. And again, he's got a Microsoft Word key that tells you what these numbers mean. On the left side, you can see the color coding. So how does he visually represent that proportion? And he visually represents it through the colors that are on the left side. And here again, it's the more familiar blue-red shading. Red meaning Republican, blue meaning Democratic. So I'll just grab a couple. The darkest blue would be between 0 and 25% for John McCain in that particular VTD. The next one down will be 25 to 30% and so on.
Did you look at the properties screen for this particular map file titled NC Senate Master July 11, 0115?
I did.
We pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 566. Dr. Cooper, what is this showing us?
This is the properties file from, you can see again the title at the top, plan type State Senate, Administrator Dr. Hoffler's initials, date created. He was working real late here, looks like 1:13 in the morning, July 11th, and he modified it 1:19, and he had copied that. You can see the comments again showing the lineage of that file from NC Senate July 9th.
Okay, and I forget whether you said, but the administrator, that shows his initials again?
It does, yeah. So it says TBH, and those are obviously Dr. Hoffler's initials.
So in this particular screen, we can see on the right-hand side, it doesn't look like the color coding that you described a moment ago, corresponding to partisanship, is actually visible there. Do you have an understanding of why that is?
Sure. So you can have different things active at different times. He had it active and he had it available, but not displayed on the screen. Okay, and what I mean, or not displayed on the map. What I mean by that is you've got whatever data you can show. It's essentially 2 clicks to get the formula, to get those data to show visually on the screen. So it's available. It was right there. It just happened to be not visible on the map at the moment he saved that file.
And the data that you could get to be visible that you're referring to is the partisanship data as color-coded. We can see on the left-hand side of the screenshot.
That's correct. Just as you can make water area appear or not appear with a couple of clicks, you can make partisanship appear or not appear, in this case with a couple of clicks.
So this particular file appears to be from the state Senate map that Dr. Hoffler was working on in 2011. Did you look at any of Dr. Hoffler's map files that showed you what he was working on for the North Carolina House map in 2011?
Yes.
Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 350. Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 350?
This is the partisan formula field. Probably looks familiar by now. You can see here again, 2011, his formula is just proportion for John McCain. So it's a simpler formula, and then you can see on the left side the visual representation, how that formula will be translated to the map. 0 to 30% for the Republican candidate, in this case McCain, 30 to 35%, and so on.
So again, the red and the blue, as we're familiar with it, showing Republican or Democratic leaning VTDs on Dr. Hoffler's map.
That's correct. So this is the screenshot, and then the blue is the Democratic leaning VTDs, and the red are the Republican leaning VTDs.
And it looks like this map file is titled NC House Master July 18, 1200. Is that right?
Yes, and you can see that right at the top of the screen, just below the shortcuts.
Did you look at metadata for this particular map file of Dr. Hoffler's as you were inspecting it?
I did.
Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 563. So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 563?
We're looking at this properties field. It's probably familiar by now. We've talked about how you get here, and you can see this was created July 18th, 2011 at 11:37, and it was modified July 21st, 2011, 16:13 in this case. And you can also see the, again, the partisan formula field active on the left side.
Okay. So this particular map file has July 18 in the title. July 18, and it appears to be from 2011, as you can see in the properties screen that we're looking at here.
Yes.
Did you look at any of Dr. Hoffler's map files from a different period in the summer of 2011 that related to his NC House districts as he was drawing them?
I did.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 352. So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 352?
We're looking at the formula field from the June 28th dot map file. Again, you can see the formula field here, clearly represented, and you can see the color coding on the left.
Okay, and this is the same partisan formula that we saw a moment ago,
That's right, percent of the vote for John McCain.
and the same color coding scheme that we saw in the last file that we looked at for the North Carolina House in 2011.
Essentially, yes. So blue is Democratic, red is Republican.
And this file is labeled or titled NC House with New Raleigh, June 28. Is that correct?
That's correct. So it says right there at the top, as I just highlighted, NC House with New Raleigh, June 28th dot map.
Okay. And in this file that you looked at, the partisanship measure color coding was turned on as Dr. Hoffler was working with the map.
That's correct.
All right. Let's take a look. Well, let me ask you, did you look at metadata for this particular map file as well?
I did.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 564.
Yes. Okay.
And I won't belabor the point, but we're looking at a similar property screen that we looked at for the other 4 map files so far. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it shows us the date created and the last modified date?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's take a look at other screenshots of this particular NC House 2011 map file that Dr. Hoffler was working with. Can we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 353? Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this exhibit, particularly as the color coding relates to the district boundaries that we can see here in red?
Sure. So this one is going to be maybe the most familiar map that we'll see, right? This was very similar to the legend map we saw from the Maps My Report. We obviously looked at this cluster, and so you can see Anson and Union counties, and we've talked ad nauseum about the split in Monroe and how that cracked Democratic voters across 2 districts represented here in the blue, and you can see that cracking really exactly as we saw it in the maps that I presented before.
So again, sort of this surgical precision of the boundaries moving around the blue or Democratic-leaning VTDs in these 2 House districts, or 3 House districts, I should say.
That's right. I mean, so clearly, Dr. Hoffler knew what the partisan consequences of drawing these lines where he drew them were going to be.
Let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 354. So this looks to be another screenshot from this particular North Carolina 2011 House map file that Dr. Hoffler was working with. Can you tell us what we can see here with the color coding and district boundaries?
Sure. So here we're seeing, we're kind of focused on Alamance County, and we've talked about the sort of duck's head, I guess, around Burlington, and again, not that Burlington is split, but the specific way in which Burlington was split. Did the way it was split have partisan consequences? I think we established before the answer is yes. Did the primary architect, Dr. Hoffler, have access to that at the time? Yes. I think you can see it's very, it looks very similar to the map we saw before. And so you can see the blue VTDs again being separated out from the red VTDs.
So Dr. Cooper, we've now talked about a number of screenshots from Dr. Hoffler's map files as he was working on them in both 2011 and 2017 for both the North Carolina Senate and the North Carolina House. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you inspect parts of the draft maps in these map files in any other areas that we haven't actually looked at here in screenshots today?
Yes.
And did you take similar screenshots of those other areas and the other districts that you inspected as Dr. Hoffler was working on them?
Yes.
And those screenshots that we didn't necessarily look at today, they're all contained within your expert report from June of this year?
Yes.
And just so it's absolutely clear, for any of the screenshots contained in your expert report of June, including those we looked at today and the others that we didn't actually put up on the screen, you didn't alter the map files in any way before taking the screenshots?
No.
and all of the screenshots contained in your expert report from June are fair and accurate depictions of what you were actually able to personally observe as you opened up those map files.
Yes.
Okay. So, Dr. Cooper, we've talked about a lot yesterday afternoon and this morning, and the different conclusions you were able to come to in this case. But before I conclude, could you just summarize for the court what your opinions were, what your opinions are in this case that you were able to arrive at from all of this analysis?
Sure. So I think you asked me at the outset, why I did this, why I agreed to do this work, and I said part of it is I wanted to try to solve this puzzle, to try to understand, one, is the North Carolina General Assembly out of step with the rest of the state, as it kind of seemed like it was, and if so, why? And after looking at statewide election returns and comparing North Carolina, both the statewide returns to the General Assembly returns and also our state citizenry to other states, it did appear that the General Assembly seemed to be out of step. I then inspected the boundaries of these maps, considered the decisions that were made and the discretion the map maker had, and from there it seemed very clear that these decisions had partisan consequences. And then by inspecting some of the files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive, I think I was able to see that the map maker, the primary map maker, had access to these data and had knowledge of these partisan implications. So I think if you put all that together, it really does seem like these lines were drawn to benefit one party at the expense of the other. So what I defined at the beginning is gerrymandering.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Your Honor, I have no further questions for Dr. Cooper at this time, but I will move into evidence at this point. The exhibits that we discussed in his testimony or that came up in his testimony were referred to.
Are there objections to those exhibits? I know we're talking about a group of exhibits and we may need to get more specific, but Ms. McKnight, do you have objections to those exhibits?
Yeah, so to the extent we're referring to reports, I think that's exhibit 253, 254, and I've got 329 here. We just renew our objections to those reports coming in on the grounds of hearsay and renew our earlier arguments on that. We understand the court's ruling on that issue. And then the other documents that we would object to are exhibits 330 to 356, which I understand to be the Hoffler files. I believe that there were additional Hoffler files in the 500s that were referred to earlier today. We would renew our objection to those on the basis that had been previously stated. And I believe we do not have any other objections to the remaining exhibits.
And Your Honor, I apologize. I probably, just for the benefit of the record, should state the full set, the full range of exhibits, just so it's absolutely clear what we're moving in here.
I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. So, Your Honor, they're in three chunks. So, plaintiff exhibits 253 through 356. Plaintiff's exhibits 562 through 566. And plaintiff's exhibits 724 through 728. One other point of clarification. Plaintiff's exhibit 253 and plaintiff's exhibit 329, those are the two expert reports that Dr. Cooper submitted in this case. Plaintiff's exhibit 254 is his CV. So I'm not sure if that's an objection that defendants stand on, but I just wanted to point that out as well.
All right.
And I'll just make clear for the record, I believe the exhibits in the 700s, I don't believe they were used, at 724 to 728. Is that Hoffler files? Is that what that is?
Yeah, so those are the underlying files, the file names of which Dr. Cooper referred to in his testimony today, and that are also, the full file path is included in his expert report, Exhibit 329. So those are just the underlying files for the screenshots that we actually put up on the screen.
Well, we would have the same objection to that. That's the Hoffler files.
And these are on the thumb drive, Your Honor, just for clarity.
Very good. The objections are of the same ilk as those made to Dr. Chin's And we have discussed those among ourselves previously, and our rulings on those, each of those would be the same. So the exhibits 253 through 356 are allowed, 562 through 566 are allowed, and 724 through 728 are allowed. The reports are allowed, again, for corroborative purposes, not substantive purposes, but they're admitted for that purpose.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. We're going to take a 8-minute recess before we continue with cross-examination. That will take us to 10:12. All right. Very good. So cross-examination, Mr. McKnight.
Yes, Your Honor. And if I don't speak in this mic, please let me know. Good morning again, Dr. Cooper. We met, in addition to seeing each other and passing in the halls here, we've met last month at your deposition. My name is Michael McKnight, and I'm one of the attorneys for the legislative defense in this case. Dr. Cooper, you've never been retained by any legislator to provide advice on any redistricting matter, have you?
I have not.
And you've never been retained by any other political body to provide advice on any redistricting matter, have you?
I have not.
And you've never drawn district lines for any political body, have you?
No.
And in forming your opinions for this case, you didn't interview any member of the General Assembly, did you?
I did not interview members of the General Assembly for this case, no.
And in forming your opinions for this case, you didn't interview anyone who works at the General Assembly, did you?
No, I did not.
And in forming your opinions for this case, you didn't interview anyone who has ever been a candidate for the North Carolina General Assembly, did you?
No, I did not.
And in forming your opinions for this case, you didn't interview anyone who has ever been a candidate for any public office in North Carolina, did you?
No.
Forming your opinions for this case, you didn't interview any North Carolina voter, did you?
No, not in any formal way, no.
Now, you just testified about maps that were produced using a computer program called Maptitude, is that right?
That's correct.
You don't use Maptitude in your professional work, do you?
No, as I've talked about, I've used mapping software, but I've not used Maptitude. I do not have a license for Maptitude.
All right. And you never used Maptitude at all, have you?
As I just said, I don't have a license for Maptitude. I've used mapping software. I've not used Maptitude.
You don't have Maptitude installed on any computer that you use, do you?
Again, do not have a license, don't have it installed.
You've never received any training on Maptitude, have you?
I've received training on other GIS software. I've never received formal training on WordPerfect, but I think I could probably open it as well as I could open Microsoft Word.
Okay, but the question is, you've never received any training on Maptitude, have you?
I've not received specific training on the software program Maptitude, no.
And you didn't produce any of the maps you just testified about, did you?
I made decisions for those maps. I did not click to get those data represented visually, no.
Mr. Esselstyn did that for you, didn't
I think it's Esselstyn, but yes.
he? Try to get that right, but you can tell me if I don't. You didn't confirm that all the maps in the report that you produced are accurate, did you?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Certainly. You didn't confirm that all of the maps in the report are accurate, did you?
I would not agree to that, no.
Okay, so you confirmed that they were all accurate?
I compared the contours of the lines on the maps that are in my report to the contours of the lines on the General Assembly's redistricting website. We also had access to a common data set which had VTD level votes for the Attorney General election. And so frequently I would want to understand the behavior of a specific VTD, and I was able to do that from the same data set.
All right, but you're saying that you confirmed, you looked at every map that's in your report and you confirmed its accuracy, is that right?
I'm saying I compared every map in my report to the district lines as represented on the North Carolina General Assembly's redistricting website. I'm saying that I had access to the same data set that showed partisanship and that I used those same data.
All right, now, at the time of your deposition, had you done that?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we pull up your deposition then, and look at page 150.
Okay.
And we're going to start looking at line 3.
Okay.
I'll read the question, and then I'll ask you to read the answer.
Sure.
Your Honor, I just ask, can we wait one moment while the co-counsel has a chance to pass the actual deposition transcript?
Thank you.
Do you want a hard copy, Mr.
Sure.
Cooper? May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Are we ready?
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Let's start at line 3. I think I asked you in the deposition, did you verify whether the data is correctly incorporated in these maps?
Every VTD?
Yes.
No, I did not.
Okay.
Sorry. Spot check every row?
I said, okay, did you spot check any of them?
Yes.
I said, okay, how many?
I said no idea.
I said, was it 10 or 20 or was it more than that?
I said way more than that.
Okay. And I said, 100, you don't know? Is that right, you don't know?
I said I don't want to hazard a guess for how many cells I clicked on.
Okay. So it sounds like to me from that testimony, you had not checked every map. Is that right?
No. You asked me there if I had checked every VTD, if I had clicked in every cell for every VTD in every one of the clusters I looked at. And the answer then and the answer now is no. I have not clicked in every cell and hand-checked every VTD's voting totals.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at with my question, but I apologize if I was not clear. Speaking of VTDs, you don't know the reason why any VTD was split in any of the maps you testified about today, do you?
Can you repeat that question?
Certainly. You don't know the reason why any VTD was split in any of the maps you testified about today, do you?
I'm testifying about the partisan effect of those, and the partisan effect of those considered in totality. I did not, as you established, did not interview anyone and say, why did you split X VTD in Y place?
So you don't know the reason why it was split, you only know the effect.
I did not interview anyone and ask them that question.
So you wouldn't have that knowledge, right?
I know what the effects are, and I know that taken as a totality, those decisions seem to benefit one party at the expense of the other.
Now, you didn't analyze any data below the VTD level, did you?
Some, not in every map. Obviously, the voter file, which I looked at some, does have VTD data below the VTD level, but that was not the major part of my analysis, I would agree.
All right, and you studied no voters in any VTD, correct?
What do you mean by studying a voter?
Did you study any particular voters in any particular VTD?
You mean interview again?
Did you study them in any way?
An individual voter? So did I say, John Smith lives in District 5 and interview John Smith about what he thinks? No.
You didn't look at the impact of any district line on any individual voter in the VTD, did you?
I did not interview any individual voter and ask them about the impact of their district lines. I think there's a rich literature in political science about this that I did look at, but I did not talk to a specific voter as we established.
All right. And you don't know how county groupings in North Carolina are determined, do you?
I know that we have county groupings in the state of North Carolina. I know that we have to follow them. I know they change from redistricting cycle to redistricting cycle. I know they're created for population equality. And I moved from the assumption that these county groupings are active.
All right. And you believe that district lines only handicap an election, not decide an election, is that right?
I don't think any one factor decides any election.
Now, you don't know whether it would be a gerrymander for a legislature to draw district lines with the goal of creating competitive districts, do you?
Can you repeat that?
You don't know whether it would be a gerrymander for a legislature to draw district lines with the goal of creating competitive districts, do you?
That is not something that I looked at in my report. That was not a question that I asked. Therefore, it's not a question that I answered.
All right, you can't define what a competitive district is that right?
I do not have a line in the sand. I'm not going to say that a competitive district is one that is greater than 10 but less than 9, but I do rely on other people's estimates of competitiveness as in my report.
All right, in your report, I don't know that you testified about this yesterday. I didn't hear if you did. I believe you say in your report that Democrats need 54% to win a majority in both the House and the Senate of the current maps. Is that correct?
Take your word for it that I said that in the report. It sounds like that was the uniform swing analysis portion of the report.
And that's exactly what I'm getting at here.
Great.
So I believe you testified in your report, you said that in the Senate that Democrats would need to receive 54.41% of the statewide vote to receive a majority in the General Assembly of the current maps, and that Democrats would need to receive 54.2% of the statewide vote to receive a majority in the House. And if you want to reference the report, we can pull up the report. It's Plaintiff's Exhibit 253, and I'm looking at page 16.
So you're looking at the last sentence of the last full paragraph?
That's right. There's a reference on that page to the amount of the statewide vote that Democrats must receive in order to receive a majority in both the House and the Senate.
So this is starting to win the least competitive of these?
Well, I guess what I'm looking at is the sentence that says, assuming that the vote share across the state would uniformly swing. You see that?
I do.
Okay. Would you read that for the record, please?
Assuming that the vote share across the state would uniformly swing by that amount, Democrats would need to secure 54.2% of the statewide votes, 51.1% plus 3.1%, to regain a simple majority of seats in the state House of Representatives.
And earlier in that paragraph, you discussed the Senate, right? In the middle of that paragraph, you say that Democratic candidates would have to win 54.41% of the statewide vote to garner a simple majority in the Senate seats. Do you see that?
I do. Before that, I say, assuming that the vote share across the state would uniformly swing by that amount, and then continues on with what you said.
All right. So my question then is, those numbers are both based upon a uniform swing analysis. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And that analysis is based on the assumption that the Democratic vote share across the state would uniformly swing by the same amount. Is that right?
Yes, that's how the uniform swing analysis works.
But you didn't perform any study for this case to determine whether that would in fact happen, did you?
No, I think it is trying to give people a sense of what would a uniform swing accomplish. So if everything, we're moving from the assumption, if everything swung by X amount, what would happen? So a uniform swing analysis is not supposed to figure out the probability of some occurrence. It's saying if this happened, what else would happen?
Well, it's not an analysis, then it's an assumption, isn't it?
It's an analysis built off of an assumption, as are most.
All right. Dr. Cooper, would you agree that every VTD that is included in or removed from a district has some political consequence?
I would say that. I would probably use the word partisan instead of political, but sure.
Okay. So every VTD that is put in a district is going to make that district more or less Republican, right?
Yes.
Or more or less Democratic?
Not by the same amount for either one, but sure.
Now, we discussed your definition of gerrymandering yesterday. I think you repeated it today. But as I understand that definition, it is when one party draws lines to benefit themselves at the expense of the other party. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
Now, if you assume that some use of political data is permissible in redistricting, how do you determine whether a districting plan is a gerrymander under that definition?
I think that's exactly what I tried to do over the course of 102 pages in my initial report and 50 some odd pages in my second report.
Okay, and you can't point me to any specific area in that report where you specifically do that.
I think the entire report does that. As I laid out at the beginning, the point of that of the report, both reports, was to answer that question.
Well, in order to determine whether a district fits your definition of a gerrymander, you have to see what the district lines look like and also review election results from that district. Is that right?
That's one thing I would want to do.
And even then, whether a district fits your definition of a gerrymander depends on other circumstances. Is that right?
I think I employed a host of data to answer this question, and I would want to see those data.
Now, did you share all of those different circumstances and factors that you consider with any of the plaintiff's simulation experts in this case?
I did not confer with the simulation experts.
So you can't be sure that their simulations take into account all the various circumstances or factors that you believe go into determining whether a district is a gerrymander, can you?
I did not confer with the other experts. I'm not going to weigh in on what the other experts can and cannot do. I thought we did that for 2.5 days.
What is the purpose of simulations to create a nonpartisan baseline against which the challenge maps can be compared?
I'm not a simulation expert. I do not pretend to be a simulation expert. I'm not weighing in on simulations. Again, I think we've been over that, and from what I understand, we'll go over that again.
Okay. Well, you have no statistical principle or quantitative measure that you can use to determine if a district is a gerrymander, do you?
I think I presented a host of statistical and quantitative measures. We've looked at a lot of numbers today and yesterday.
But you don't have a specific statistical principle, quantitative measure that works on a statewide basis that can be used to determine if a district is a gerrymander, do you?
I do not have a single number, a single line in the sand. I'm not going to tell you that if some measure is greater than 10.2, then it is a gerrymander, and if it's less than 10.2, that it's not a gerrymander. I don't think that's the way this works. I think the way gerrymandering works are small decisions to consistently benefit one party at the expense of the other party.
You would agree that there are things other than district lines that influence whether or not a candidate wins an election?
Yes.
All right? And those things can include political geography.
Part of which is the way district lines are drawn.
All right? How about candidate quality?
Candidate quality can matter.
How about the dynamics of the race that two candidates are in?
Look, all these things matter. We all saw the Roy Moore election in Alabama. We know that candidate quality can matter. The question is, does everybody start on an even playing field? Does the tug-of-war game start with us in the same position, or does the tug-of-war game start with you in front or me in front?
Well, how about the mood of the country?
The mood of the country can matter, as it did in this last election cycle, as it did in 2010.
So factors like the mood of the country can affect the tug-of-war position, can't they? If the mood of the country is against Republicans in one year, will Republicans start out further behind the line than Democrats?
They might, but that's up to the will of the voters. That's up to the voters' beliefs about the candidates and about how they want to be represented. That is not some exogenous factor that's creating an artificial tug-of-war game before we start.
All right, how about fundraising? Does that go into the calculus?
I think fundraising can matter depending on the disparity between candidates.
How about voter turnout?
I think voter turnout both can affect the election outcomes. I also think voter turnout can be affected by the way district lines are drawn. We know that people tend to vote if they think their vote matters.
But you haven't conducted any study for this case that says that any of the district lines in this case discouraged or prevented anybody from voting, have you?
I think there's a large literature in political science that says that when people think their vote counts, they're more likely to vote. I did not conduct a survey related to this case of individual voters.
Along the same lines, you can't quantify how much the district lines that are issued here impacted the ability of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party to get their candidates elected in the North Carolina General Assembly in 2018. Can you?
I did not ask that question. I did not try to come up with a proportion that it mattered. The point I was making was consistently, when discretion is exercised, the discretion favored one party at the expense of the other party.
Let's pull up a copy of an exhibit that has been marked as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 150. I have copies for the panel, and I'll get up and stretch my legs to hand out a copy of it.
Can I ask you, is there any way to get the Elmo down a little? I feel like I'm trying to look around to see you.
I don't know, I might break it. Bye.
It's not the end of the world, but
I'm probably the worst person in the world to try to do that.
It's all right.
I'll leave it
No-
alone.
no worries.
Someone else knows what they can do. All right, Dr. Cooper, I believe we've got a copy on the screen, and you should now have a copy of Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 150. Dr. Cooper, do you recognize this document?
dude.
And what is it?
This is an op-ed that I wrote on May 8th, 2016 for the Asheville Citizen-Times.
And the title of it is The Boogeymen in American Politics. Is that right?
It is. I don't write the headlines for the op-eds that I write, but that is the headline that was printed with it.
All right. And one of the two boogeymen you discuss in this article is redistricting reform. Is that right?
As it pertains to polarization, yes.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to the third paragraph of this editorial. Would you please read what you wrote in that third paragraph?
Let's start with redistricting reform. As most readers know, the Constitution requires that we redraw district lines every 10 years to account for demographic shifts. It doesn't take long for the redistricting process to be captured by political parties in an effort to increase their share of the legislative pie, a strategy known as gerrymandering.
All right. And then in the next paragraph, you also wrote that gerrymandering has since become the scapegoat of many of the biggest problems in American politics, most notably political polarization. Did I read what you wrote correctly?
You did.
And you still stand by that statement, don't you?
Most notably political polarization.
All right. And to support that statement, you gave as an example the U.S. Senate, which you acknowledge was free from the redistricting process, but demonstrates about the same levels of political polarization as the lower house.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, at the time you wrote these words, you were a supporter of redistricting reform, right?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. At the time you wrote this editorial, you were a supporter of redistricting reform.
I've always thought that we can do a better job drawing district lines.
Okay.
I've never have campaigned for redistricting reform, never given money to a redistricting reform group. I've never showed up to a redistricting reform rally.
Well, I want to look then at the fifth paragraph of this editorial. And in that fifth paragraph, you wrote this: Redistricting is also frequently blamed for the difference between the overall votes in the state and the number of seats given to each party. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Then you mentioned as an example that after the 2012 election in North Carolina, more North Carolinians voted for Democratic members of Congress than Republican members of Congress, yet the Republicans won 9 of North Carolina's 13 House seats. Did I get that right?
You did.
And then you concluded that paragraph by writing that while it's convenient to suggest that reforming the redistricting process would solve or at least alleviate this problem, this situation can be blamed as much, if not more, on the way we have settled and migrated than on the redistricting process. Did I read what you wrote there correctly?
You did.
And you still stand by that, don't you?
Well, I think when I'm referring to the United States Congress, this is obviously a case, as we all know, about the General Assembly. I think that's a big difference. I would certainly acknowledge, as I think anybody would, that settlement patterns matter. The degree to which they matter, I think, is the question. But certainly where people settle matters.
Well, in the last paragraph on this page, you explain that concept further. Would you please read what you wrote in that last paragraph?
Sure. As America's cities have become increasingly democratic, there are few ways to draw district lines that do not result in the Democrats winning a few urban districts by large numbers, therefore spreading the Republican vote out across many more districts. It is therefore hard to imagine any redistricting mechanism that does not result in some difference between votes and seats, and likely a difference that benefits the grand old party.
All right. And as you just discussed, you can't quantify how much of the difference between votes and seats in North Carolina is attributable to the fact that cities have become increasingly Democratic.
I think I said here, and I believe some difference.
But you can't quantify it.
I think I have quantified it again over the course of many pages. I'm not coming up with a single metric that compares and says that X percentage is because of Y factor.
You haven't come up with a single number either, have you?
I think everybody in the courtroom would agree there's been a lot of numbers that we've come up with when describing gerrymandering in North Carolina that I've presented.
Which is all the more reason why I want to know, is there a specific number of seats that you think is attributable to the fact that Democrats are concentrated in cities?
There's not a single number that I tried to find, therefore there's not a single number that I did find.
All right. And with respect to this editorial, no one paid you to write it, did they?
I'm sorry?
No one paid you to write this editorial, did they?
That is correct.
Okay. And you hadn't been retained as an expert witness by the plaintiffs in this case at the time you wrote this editorial, did you?
I had not.
All right. I want to look at some of the specific charts and exhibits that we went over earlier. And I believe that you testified on direct about figure 6 from plaintiff's exhibit 260. So I'd like to turn to that
Okay.
figure first. Now, Dr. Cooper, this chart cannot be used to determine whether there are any ideological shift in the North Carolina General Assembly that occurred following the 2017 round of redistricting count.
No, the data are not available past 2016.
So this chart does not include any data about average member ideology following the 2017 redistricting.
I think that's established. The x-axis stops at 2016,
All right.
and the data are not available past 2016.
Now, this chart shows a shift in average member ideology in both the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate immediately following the 2010 election. Is that right?
That's correct.
But that shift could not have been due to redistricting, could it?
That shift is not due to redistricting. That's also not the point of why this graph is in, this figure is in my report. What I was trying to demonstrate is when partisanship shifts, so does political ideology. This is not just a shift in name, this is a shift in policy direction.
All right. Now, you testified earlier about the distribution of Civitas action scores for 2018, And you also testified that you prepared 2 exhibits related to that. I believe those exhibits are Plaintiff's Exhibits 269 and 270. Could we pull up 269? And just for a second, could we flip to Exhibit 270? All right. Now, the ratings in this chart, as I see from the top, are from 2018. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as a result, they don't include votes taken by legislators who were elected in the November 2018 general election following the 2017 redistricting cycle. Is that right?
That's correct.
Let's talk about some of the specific areas and maps that we looked at earlier. I want to turn your attention to Plaintiff's Exhibit 272 next. This county cluster includes Senate Districts 8 and 9, and I'll wait a minute for everybody to get there. Now, do you recall testifying earlier about what was described by you as the Wilmington Notch?
I do.
Okay. Now, you testified yesterday that the General Assembly had to place some portion of New Hanover County in the Senate District 8, is that right?
That's correct.
But you have not provided the court with any alternative map showing what portion of New Hanover County you believe should have been placed in Senate District 8 rather than the 2 precincts in Wilmington that were included in the enacted map.
Because we established I did not draw alternative lines. I'm not planning to draw alternative lines. The point here was there was discretion to be exercised. There were many VTDs that could have been included, and the ones that included benefited one party at the expense of the other.
And sitting here today, you can't tell the court which precincts from New Hanover County that you believe should have been placed in Senate District 8 rather than the 2 precincts that were drawn into that district in the enacted map.
I'm not engaging in a should exercise today. I've not been engaging in a should exercise at any point since I've been involved in this case. I think I'm saying, here are the effects of the district lines as they exist today.
All right, I want to flip back to your report to talk about the next group of Senate districts. And I want to, the report again is Plaintiff's Exhibit 253. And I want to focus your attention specifically on some language that is found on page 33 of that report. Now, on page 33, you're talking about Senate Districts 10, 11, and 12. And that's the span of Senate districts that runs from Nash County down to Lee County. Do you remember that?
I do.
All right. And on page 33, you say that Senate Districts 10, 11, and 12 should have contained what you describe as at least one relatively competitive district, given the partisan makeup of its counties. And then you say all 3 districts of this cluster are dominated by Republicans. Did I accurately summarize what you said on that page?
Yes.
Okay. But as we talked about earlier, you can't describe what a competitive district would look like in this county cluster, can you?
I'm not going to draw lines and say this, that's not what I do. I don't draw lines and say this is a competitive district, this is not a competitive district. Again, I did not draw any new lines. I did not consider alternative maps.
All right. It might be helpful to pull out the map, which is located as identified as Plaintiff's Exhibit 274 for these counties. For my next questions here. Now, even though you haven't drawn any alternative maps, you would agree that it isn't possible to unite the darkest blue precincts in this county cluster in a single district, right?
Yes.
Okay, because they're located around the city of Rocky Mount and the city of Sanford, isn't that right?
Yes, with some around Clinton as well.
But it wouldn't be possible to unite the blue precincts in the city of Rocky Mount with the city of Clinton, would it?
I don't know. I haven't analyzed that. I don't know if it's possible or not, actually. I don't know.
Well, that district would have to take up all of Nash County, it would have to snake through Johnson County, and then it would have to somehow go down to Clinton.
It would.
But that would be very realistic, would it?
Probably not.
Somebody would probably say that's a gerrymander, wouldn't they?
I don't know what somebody would say about a district that does not exist.
Okay, all right. Well, let's turn then to Plaintiff's Exhibit 281. This is the Guilford, Alamance, and Randolph Senate grouping that we talked so much about over the last couple of days.
Re-ask your question, Ms. McKnight, specifying the counties that you're looking at.
Sure, we're looking at the Guilford, Alamance, and Randolph grouping. Now, I believe we discussed earlier that Senate District 28 was one of the districts that was redrawn by the special master. Do you remember that?
I do.
Now, why is it Senate District 28 an example of packing Democrats, as you use the term pack?
I did not analyze Senate District 28 in any depth.
Well, just looking at the map, does it look like it packs Democrats?
I did a lot more than look at the map.
Okay. Does it look like Democrats were fenced off from Republican voters in Guilford County?
It actually looks to me, if you follow the fence, that there's plenty of blue on the other side of the fence as well.
Okay, so as long as there's some amount of blue outside a district that looks like this, that district is not fencing off Democratic voters?
That's not what I said. You said, does this look like it fences Democratic voters from Republican voters? And I'm saying if you examine the contours of the line, or the fence in this case, it doesn't appear that way as I sit here today.
Okay. Well, you also wrote about this group of districts in your report. You remember doing that?
I do.
Well, let's turn back to your report, which is Exhibit 253, and I want to refer you to page 42.
Okay.
And on this page, you wrote, in a textbook example of gerrymandering, rather than place the politically and culturally similar conservative areas of Guilford County in the same districts or in the same district as heavily Republican Randolph County, the current Senate District 26 lines capture the heavily Democratic areas of High Point, the only Democratic VTDs that lie on the Randolph-Guilford County border. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. Let's look then at Plaintiff's Exhibit 282. Now, this is the Davy and Forsyth group, 282. And so my question for you is, why couldn't District 31 in Davie and Forsyth County be described as a district that places the politically and culturally similar conservative areas of Forsyth and Davie County in the same district?
I think this would be described as a district that combines the eastern and western portions of the same district together that geographically would make very little sense to be together. They both share partisanship in common, but that's about it.
But your quote was, you thought that in the Guilford-Randolph grouping, the politically and culturally similar conservative areas should be grouped together. You didn't say anything about geography there.
Actually, I did. I said that of all of the VTDs on that border that they could have conceivably combined it with, they selected the most Democratic.
Okay. Well, let's look back then at that particular grouping. And I believe that's the previous exhibit, which would be Exhibit 281.
Okay?
And looking at the precincts that are selected from High Point to go into District 26, wouldn't those precincts be more densely populated, given that they're in the city of High Point, than other precincts that could have been selected from Guilford County to be grouped in Randolph County?
I haven't looked at that, but probably so.
Okay. And speaking of your color scheme here, I wanted to ask you about this. You've done the way you've done the colors here is you've distributed the population by acre. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. So would it be true that in more densely populated areas, those areas are going to more naturally be darker than less densely populated areas? Is that right?
Depends on that combined with the vote totals, right? There's two parts of it, the vote total and the acreage.
So can you say how the use of acreage affects the color scheme here?
I'm saying that it's standardized by acre, but you could definitely have very, very dark acres. I would imagine if you look at Graham County, you would probably see very large VTDs with very large population that are very, very dark.
So the bottom line is that the colors in your maps are affected by the density of each of the VTDs. Is that fair to say?
It is part of the calculation.
Okay. Now, if the map drawer here had selected precincts other than precincts in High Point, they would have had to have taken a much larger chunk of Guilford County to get the same population paired with Randolph County, right?
Again, I don't know off the top of my head what the population of these VTDs are.
All right. Well, let's turn then to plaintiff's exhibit 85. I'm sorry, 285.
Okay.
This is a map of the Senate districts in Mecklenburg County. And in looking at the districts in Mecklenburg County, why could you say that District 39 could be described as a district that places the politically and culturally similar conservative areas of Mecklenburg County together?
I don't know if they're culturally similar or not. I know that this map has partisan consequences. I think is pretty clear to the naked eye.
So my question though is, why do you say that about this district the same way you said that about what should have happened with respect to the Randolph and Guilford districts?
I've described what I thought were the political effects of drawing the district lines the way we drew them in and around districts 39, 41, 37, 40, and 38 in Mecklenburg County.
Now, you spent a lot of time when we were talking about Senate District 41, and that's the district that contains the quarry, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Now, do you know if there's any historical precedent for Mecklenburg County having a Senate district that contains portions of the northern part of the county that curve around in a C shape around the western and southern parts of the county?
I did not compare this to old maps.
All right. Could we then pull up on the screen the 2002 map of Senate District 40 in Mecklenburg County. And I've got copies that I can hand out here. Could I approach you?
Yes, please.
And if we could, do a split screen showing this district and comparing it with plaintiff's exhibit 285. So, Dr. Cooper, my question for you is, did you know that the court in the Stevenson versus Bartlett case adopted an interim Senate map for use in the 2002 elections that contained a version of District 40 in this map that wraps around Mecklenburg County, much like the version of Senate District 40 that ended up in the challenge maps?
This is the first I've seen this map. I would challenge a little bit. I mean, looks like the map on the left also cuts into Charlotte at this. I don't want to do this because I can't get the screen back up. But there's a gray part that juts up into Charlotte on the left map that is not on the right map. It also looks like, and I would have to examine this in much greater detail, but where the quarry passage is looks much larger on this map. The map on the right goes to the southern terminus of the county, whereas the map on the left does not. The map on the left seems to jut out east much farther around Mount Holly than the one on the right, which is much tighter.
Dr. Cooper, I'll grant you that they're not the same. They're not the same maps. I think you and I can agree on that. But, so my question is that the concept of a district like this has been done before. Would you agree with that?
No, I would not agree with that.
You don't think that these districts have similar concepts at all?
No. Well, again, I would have to spend a lot more time looking at this and trying to understand the partisan consequences in the context of the other districts. But everything I've just pointed out that's different stands to reason that it would have very large, different partisan effects. I mean, you're essentially cutting into the city of Charlotte on the map on the left, you're avoiding the city of Charlotte on the map on the right. Those are fundamentally different maps. I will grant that they're both in Mecklenburg County.
All right. Well, so the bottom line, though, is you didn't consider whether there was a historical precedent for any of the challenged districts before you labeled them as a gerrymander, did you?
I did not compare the current maps to old maps.
Let's turn next to Plaintiff's Exhibit 276. This is the Wake in Franklin County.
Yep.
And yesterday, I believe you testified that there was clear Democratic packing in Senate Districts 15 and 16, and to some degree in Senate District 14.
And
Is your testimony correct?
I also believe that I noted Senate District 18 and the specific contours of 18 as being the case where it was drawn to benefit one party at the expense of the other.
Okay, but I got your testimony right as to Senate Districts 15 and 16 and 14, which you described as examples of Democratic packing.
And again, I think all of these lines touch other lines, and I think to understand the effects of any of these, you've got to understand the full context of that cluster. And I believe that I talked about Senate District 18 in the same context.
All right. Now, are you aware that Senator Dan Blue who's a senior member of the Democratic Senate Caucus, testified earlier this week that he was involved in drawing Senate Districts 14 and 15?
I'm aware that Senator Blue said he was able to weigh in on parts of the way those districts were drawn.
And those districts appear the way they do as a result of an amendment to the map that was offered by Senator Blue and adopted by the General Assembly, right?
Not 18. And I don't believe, and again, I was watching the feed like everybody else, so this is recall from 2 days ago, but if I remember correctly, what Senator Blue said was that part of it was frozen, but that the specifics were not, that he was told as long as he only stayed within some of these districts and just kept the Democratic ones together, and he could move lines how he wanted, but that 18 needed to stay untouched.
Okay, well, given, in the districts I'm asking about now is for specifically districts 14 and 15, do you still maintain your contention that districts 14 and 15 are packed with Democrats, given Senator Blue's involvement with those?
I think districts 14 and 15 have the effect of packing Democratic voters together, and I think the partisan consequences of this cluster is impossible to understand without considering the lines that they're touching and the voters that are affected in 18. It's not that you're making voters disappear, it's that voters are in either one district or another.
Well, let's turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 280 for a moment. And on this one, I want to ask you, do you think that Senator Blue engaged in partisan gerrymandering by offering an amendment to the 2017 Senate map that omitted the red precinct that contains the Northridge Country Club from District 14, which is the district he represents?
Say that one more time.
Do you think Senator Blue engaged in partisan gerrymandering by offering an amendment to the 2017 Senate map that omitted the red precinct that contains Northridge Country Club from District 14? Which is the
I'm
district
sorry, is that omitted or added?
omitted.
Omitted, go ahead. That's omitted.
The red precinct containing Northridge Country Club from District 14.
I have no opinion. Obviously, if you omitted a VTD, you added a VTD somewhere else. I didn't analyze that. I have no opinion.
All right. Let's turn our attention then to some of the House districts that you had Mr. Esselstyn create for you. Now,
He didn't create a House district for me.
okay,
Are you suggesting he
he created, well, the maps he created for you.
Okay.
Is that
Yeah.
fair?
No, I think it's an important distinction.
Okay, all right. When you stop and correct me if I mess up again like that. Now, I counted 7 House districts that are specifically mentioned in the amended complaint that are not covered in your report or in your testimony yesterday or today. And those House districts include districts in the Green, Wayne, Sampson, Blade, Johnston, Harnett, and Lee cluster. So, and then there are also House districts, 2 House districts, House districts 113 and 117 that were included in the Transylvania, Henderson, and Polk cluster. Do you
Okay.
remember looking at those House districts?
So these are House districts that I did not report on in my report?
Yeah, that was a convoluted question,
That's
so I
all right.
apologize. Let me ask you a more simple one. If the district was included in the amended complaint, if it was featured in the amended
Sure.
complaint, where that complaint discussed the specific districts, and you didn't discuss it in your report, it's safe to say you didn't find any problems with any of those districts?
No, it's not safe to say that.
Okay. Now, well, do you remember when we talked about that in your deposition?
I don't, but
Okay. Why don't we turn to page 171 of your deposition, and we'll see if maybe I misunderstood your testimony. Now, page 171, the context of our discussion was whether you had offered alternative maps as a solution for any of the issues that you pointed out with the districts. And I think I asked you the question, I asked you whether, in looking at the district maps here, whether you decided any of the district lines weren't a problem. And I'm looking at line 9 specifically.
Okay.
And your response was, any of them I didn't talk about right. Those clusters, it's not every corner of every district is a problem. They're problematic as I see them in the ways I described them in the report.
Okay.
And so it was my understanding from that you were saying that districts that you did not specifically discuss in your report were not a problem.
No,
Is
that's
that not what you were saying?
no, that's and I'll grant you my words don't exactly read as Shakespeare there, but that's not what I was offering at all. I analyzed only the clusters that I was asked to analyze as part of this project. I did not analyze the others and decide that they passed in some way and not report on them, if that's the question. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
Okay. So you didn't look at House Districts 10, 26, 28, 51, or 53?
If it's not mentioned in my report, I did not analyze the contours of those lines.
You weren't asked to look at
That is correct.
those. All right. So let's talk further then about House Districts 4, 14, and 15. And that is the Duplin and Onslow group.
Okay.
And probably would help everybody if we pull up a map here. And I believe that map would be found on Plaintiff's Exhibit 291. We'll get that up on the screen. Now, I believe this grouping contains what you described yesterday as the shark's tooth. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and that shark's tooth is located in House District 15, is that right?
That's correct.
All right, and it's your contention that by moving that single blue VTD to either House District 14 or House District 4, that would cure any gerrymander in this cluster, is that right?
No, that's not what I said at all.
Okay, well, what's the purpose then of highlighting the shark's tooth? What should be done with it?
Again, I'm not saying this would be a better line. I'm saying the current lines, as they're drawn, consistently work to the benefit of one party at the expense of the other. And that Dr. Hoffler, when he drew these maps, had access to that partisan data. Those partisan data look strikingly similar on his hard drive to the partisan data that I represented in my maps.
Now, how do you know that including the shark's tooth in District 15 benefits one party over the other?
This is about more than just the shark's tooth,
Okay.
but I think I used that as a striking example of how you can suppress the Democratic vote share. I think this is also a case where Jacksonville, if I remember correctly, was split in an odd way between these two districts. I mean, there's obviously more going on there than just the shark's tooth, and if that's what you want me to grant you, I'm happy to grant that.
All right, and you don't know that whether moving the shark's tooth from District 15 to 14 would make any difference in the electoral outcome in District 14, do you?
Two responses to that. One, moving one VTD from one district to the other necessitates putting another VTD in the other district. So it matters what the other side of that fraction is, essentially. And the other point is, I think I've made repeatedly, this is not about making the electoral difference past 50 plus 1. This is about moving the needle, sometimes in very small ways.
All right, let's move on then to House District 725. Those districts are featured in Claimant's Exhibit 293. And this is the Nash Franklin County House cluster. And I believe you testified yesterday that in this group of districts, the map drawer took the most Republican VTD in Nash County that was on the border between House District 7 and House District 25 and included it in District 7. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And it's your belief that doing that created a partisan advantage for Republicans?
Yes.
Now, are you aware that on Monday, Bob Phillips testified that this map is identical to a map that was drawn by Campbell Law students as part of a nonpartisan exercise?
I was not aware of that, but I'll take your word for it.
So if that's the case, if you take my word for that, how could these districts be a gerrymander if the individuals who drew them didn't use any partisan data in drawing?
I have not analyzed any of these common cause maps. I don't know how they were drawn. I don't know if they came from simulations. I don't know the details of those maps at all.
But if you take my assumption that no partisan data was used in drawing these, how could the districts in this cluster be a gerrymander?
Look, I think we heard a little bit from Dr. Chin about those maps, right? And if I understand correctly, the very small number that were included from the common cause maps tended to be the ones that benefited the Republican Party.
So let me understand this. In your mind, then, there is no distinction between using political data in drawing the map and using political data in deciding whether to adopt a set of districts?
I don't understand that question.
Sure. It sounds like to me you're saying that, well, if the General Assembly considered political data in deciding whether to adopt this district, that's the same as using political data in deciding how to draw. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think so. I have not examined these common cause maps. What I'm telling you is that there was a decision we made here, whether it was seen in a previous map or not, and that literally any other VTD on this border would have had different partisan consequences that would have benefited the Republican Party less than the current ones. If some people at this fine law school just drew those maps, then it happened to be the same, I have nothing to say about that.
All right. How do you know that it's possible to draw these districts in a different manner? How do you know that if you took that one Republican VTD out of House District 7 and put it in District 25, how do you know what the effect of that would be?
Again, it depends on what it's paired with. Right? We're not just putting a VTD in one and taking a VTD out of the other. Something else has to happen on the other side of the fraction, right? So we can cut out a lot of time. If you keep asking me, if we move one VTD from District A to District B, would that have made the difference? I'm going to ask you, what VTD are you moving back in? And I'm going to tell you that I don't know the partisan consequences of something I have not analyzed.
All right. Let's turn then to Plaintiff's Exhibit 305.
Okay.
Exhibit 305 depicts the House districts that are in Cumberland County.
Okay.
And I believe that yesterday you described House districts 42 and 43 as being packed with Democrats. Now, wait a minute, I'm sorry.
Sure. Okay.
All right. So you're looking at House districts 42 and 43, right?
Yes.
You would agree that you testified that they were packed with Democrats, is that right?
Sounds likely.
All right. Now, I don't think you provided much testimony on House District 44. And House District 44 has both red and blue VTDs on your map, is that right?
Under the map, yes.
Okay, under this map.
Yes.
And when I say your map, because you did the color scheme. That's what
Right. I'm sorry. When you said your map, I took that as you saying a map that I preferred.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my fault.
We're
good.
I wouldn't make that mistake.
We're good.
So, is it your opinion that House District 44 is not gerrymandered?
I don't think we can look at any of these House districts by themselves and make these decisions. Again, if you move the line one direction, it affects the other districts around it. So I'm not going to look at any individual district by itself and make a determination.
So it's your opinion that all the districts in this cluster are gerrymandered?
It is my opinion that taken as a whole, this is a gerrymandered cluster.
Right. And so how did the fact that the map drawers left what I counted 7 red BTDs in House District 44 factor into your analysis that this cluster was gerrymandered?
Well, those voters they had to be put somewhere. So they were put in a district that leaned pretty heavily towards the Democratic Party in this case. Yes, the Republicans are likely to lose 44, but they were likely to lose 44 no matter what happened.
Well, so my question is, how did you factor in the fact that they didn't try to group those 7 BTDs in 44 with 45 when you determined that the whole group was a gerrymander? How did you weigh that out?
I don't know that first of all, putting those in with 45 wouldn't have helped 45. 45 is going to go Republican the way it's drawn regardless. So putting more Republicans in with 45 just makes 44 less competitive for Republicans. It makes 45 packed with Republicans.
Okay, so the answer though is you don't have a metric by which you use to weigh these things out. When you see districts like 44 that include both Democratic and Republican BTDs, and then other districts that you contend are packed, you don't have a specific way to weigh that out so that a court or the General Assembly can determine whether, under your definition, a particular cluster is gerrymandering.
I think they would need to consider all the evidence that we've been looking at.
Let's turn then to Plaintiff's Exhibit 307, which I think you described as one of the most familiar house clusters that we've looked at.
Okay.
Exhibit 307 is the Union and Anson house cluster.
Okay.
And I want to talk about the blue VTDs that I believe are part of the city of Monroe, I think the town of Wingate as well, that are in the middle of Union County.
Okay.
You see those?
I do.
All right. Now, yesterday, and I believe today, you described the division of those blue VTDs between House District 68 and 69 as an example of cracking Democratic voters. Did I get that right?
I think so.
All right. Now, if all of those blue VTDs in the middle of Union County had been put in the same House district, why wouldn't that have been packing Democratic voters?
Again, what would have happened to the other VTDs? I can't speculate if you can't. First I need data, and second I need to know what else is happening. This isn't just you can't just add VTDs and add population to one place without taking it away. So the question is, one, what are you adding? And second, what are you subtracting?
All right. Well, without that analysis of how could a court or the General Assembly use your definitions and use your analysis to determine what they should do?
Without
Objection, Your Honor. I think the question is explicitly calling for a legal conclusion.
That's overruled.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. And let me ask it this way, maybe this will avoid the objection. How could the General Assembly use your analysis and the definitions that you've offered to avoid drawing a gerrymander if you haven't offered any alternatives?
I'm not trying to instruct the General Assembly. I'm saying I'm analyzing the districts as they exist as evidence to this court to make their decision. I'm not telling the General Assembly what they should adopt or what they should not adopt. I would not presume to do so.
So your report contains no guidelines that would be helpful for them in drawing districts in the future.
No one asked me to do that. People asked me to do an analysis of the districts as they were drawn in the political geography of our state and a set of files to look at these specific lines. No one has asked me from the legislative branch, as you established, to draw new lines or to advise them.
So your analysis is only useful after maps are already drawn, right?
This analysis was meant to be useful for this court as they made decisions on these maps.
All right. Now, let's turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 312.
Okay.
Exhibit 312 has the two House districts that are in Alamance County. And I know you testified that you didn't look at historical districts earlier, right?
That's correct.
Well, I asked you anyway, did you know if the city of Burlington was divided in the previous redistricting plans when the Democrats controlled the General Assembly?
I don't know that.
Well, why don't we pull up then, along with this map, a picture of Intervenors Trial Exhibit 42. I don't think that's the right map. I think it's a speed things along. I'll got paper copies I can hand out if I may approach your honor.
Yes, please.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for being on the screen. So, in comparing Intervenors Exhibit 42 with Plaintiff's Exhibit 312, it appears to me that the city of Burlington is divided in both maps. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with you that the city of Burlington is divided in both maps, and as I said before, a municipal split by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. The question is, how is that municipality split? What are the specific partisan effects of that split? And I think this is a really good example, actually. We saw in Dr. Hoffler's hard drive where the contours of those specific lines were drawn with almost surgical precision right around VTDs that benefited one party at the expense of the other.
Okay. Now, can you, sitting here looking at this, can you say whether you believe District 64 that's depicted in, or District 63 for that matter, the districts in that cluster that are depicted in Intervenors Exhibit 42, is that a partisan gerrymander?
I think we've established I'm not going to sit here today and opine on whether something that I haven't analyzed is a partisan gerrymander.
So what you would need to know to determine if that districts as they were drawn before 2011 were partisan gerrymanders, you have to look at the politics of the area of Burlington that was split. Is that right?
I would have to do an analysis of those districts, something I'm not prepared to do on the fly.
Okay. All right. Now, while we're in the same neighborhood, why don't we turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 313. yesterday, I believe you provided several narrations of driving along various highways and how you go into or out of one or more districts. You remember that?
I do.
All right. Now, and this particular exhibit depicts Highway 70, and I believe you provided a narration yesterday of how Highway 70 weaves in and out of House District 63 and 64. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, understanding that you've not been retained to draw district lines for any political body, are you aware of any political body that says that highways may not be crossed when district lines are drawn?
I have not.
All right. And are you aware of any court that has found a map to be a political gerrymander based upon the number of times a particular highway was crossed by the district lines of the map?
No, I am aware that if we're trying to understand the effects of how lines are drawn on actual voters, that sometimes it makes sense to get a sense of how that would feel to a voter.
All right. And did you provide plaintiff simulation experts with any parameters for how many times a highway can be crossed by the district lines and the maps they produced?
I think we've established I did not communicate with the plaintiff simulation experts at all.
So their maps may well have done the same thing that this map here did, right?
I have no idea what the specifics of their maps are. To say I skimmed their reports might be a slight overstatement.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I want to turn your attention then to Plaintiff's Exhibit 314. This is the house cluster that contains Davie, Rowan, Cabarrus, Stanley, Montgomery, and Richmond counties. And so I want to make sure I understand why you believe the districts in this cluster are a gerrymander. Now, is it your contention that these districts would not be gerrymandered if the blue VTDs that are in and around the city of Salisbury and probably Spencer and East Spencer in Rowan County were united with the blue VTDs around Kannapolis and Concord?
Analyze the lines as they're drawn.
Okay. So you can't say what would make this county cluster not a gerrymander, right?
I analyzed the lines as they were drawn.
All right. You don't know whether it's possible to unite the blue VTDs in Salisbury with the blue VTDs in Kannapolis or Concord, do you?
I have no opinion about that.
Now, why is it legitimate, Dr. Hood, for the General Assembly, I'm sorry, Dr. Cooper?
It's all right. He's a smart guy, so.
Too many experts in this case.
I understand.
Dr. Cooper, why isn't it legitimate for the General Assembly to group the communities in Rowan County that are along Highway 52, like Granite Quarry or Rockwell and Knoll Hill, along with the precincts in Salisbury, and the other areas of Rowan County that are along the High Rock Lake and Yadkin River in District 76? Why isn't that a legitimate choice?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, why isn't, I guess in short, why isn't House District 76 legitimate as it's drawn? It seems to me that it groups areas that lie along US Highway 52 that runs from Salisbury, it runs down to Albemarle. It groups those communities together and also keeps together communities that border High Rock Lake together. Why isn't that a legitimate choice by the General Assembly to do that?
I'm not arguing what's a legitimate choice. I'm
Okay.
saying that the choices that were made in this cluster had partisan consequences, and it lines up consistently to benefit one party at the expense of the other. Whether that is a legitimate choice is for this court to decide, as far as I can tell.
Well, how about the fact that in District 77, the General Assembly grouped rural Davie County with the rural parts of western Rowan County together? Couldn't that be considered a community of interest?
I don't think I've used the term community of interest today or yesterday.
Well, and I guess that brings me to my point then. Did you, when you decided that particular clusters were gerrymandered, did you consider communities of interest at all in your analysis?
I considered communities. I considered, honestly, the main thing I considered was whether it had partisan consequences and if that tended to move in the same direction or did not move in the same direction.
All right. Now, I want to look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 316. That's the House districts that are in Yankton and Forsyth counties. And I believe you testified yesterday that House District 71 and 72 were packed with Democrats. Is that right?
I'll take your word for it that I said that.
All right. Does that appear to be the case looking at your map?
Yes, yes.
All right. Now, in making that determination, did you take into consideration the fact that the map drawers left at least one red VTV in each of House District 71 and 72?
Yes.
Okay. How much did the fact that they did that weigh on your determination that these two districts were packed with Democrats?
I'm not going to give you a percentage. I didn't calculate a percentage effect.
No way to quantify that.
I would take issue with that. I think there's plenty of quantification. Some might argue too much quantification. In all 102 pages
Sorry, I think there's plenty
of quantification, some might argue too much quantification in the first 102-page report and the second 55-page report. There's plenty of quantification. There is not one single metric that is applied. No litmus test, no line in the sand.
So let's turn next to Plaintiff's Exhibit 328.
We're going to take a 10-minute recess before we do that.
All right.
At 11:45.
Period court said it is until 11:45.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. McKnight.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cooper, before we took our break, I can't tell if this mic is working or not. Anyway, before we took our break, we were starting to look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 328. And this exhibit contains a map of Warren Wilson College.
Yes,
Is that right?
That's correct.
And in your testimony earlier, you pointed out that the line between the 114th and the 115th House districts divides Warren Wilson College. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you remember describing this as one of the clearest examples of gerrymandering in this county cluster in your report?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you know if the line that divides Warren Wilson College into two House districts follows any precinct or VTV boundary?
Not off the top of my head, I don't.
All right, well, let's pull up a map then of precinct 66.1, Buncombe County. And I've got printed copies of that as well, which I'll hand out. Your Honor, if I may approach?
Yes, please.
Yeah, that's all right. Michael, we can just look on the screen.
I think this will maybe
All right,
give
thank
it
you.
back to the clerk or something there. So, if we could get, I guess, both 328 and precinct 66.1 on the same screen, I think that might help. So, looking at this map of the precinct 66.1, it appears to me to be that this map of the precinct is reversed or upside down from the map that is in Plaintiff's Exhibit 328. Is that right?
I'm honestly not sure. I'm trying to orient myself.
Okay. Well, I guess it's a zoomed out version is a better way to put it. So to try to orient ourselves here, I see 3 key roads on your map that also appear on this precinct map. Those are Warren Wilson Road. I see Warren Wilson Road, which is on the precinct map. That is labeled, it's beside the print that says B Tree Fire Department. You see that?
Yes.
There's Warren Wilson Road, and then there's also South Lane, which would be to the left of that. And then there's Riceville Road.
Okay.
And perhaps your map is, maybe it's better to say it's a zoomed-in version of that intersection, close to the intersection of Riceville Road and South Lane. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And so this map of the boundaries of precinct 66.1, that appears to run, the boundary of the precinct appears to run along Riceville Road, and then it turns on Warren Wilson Road, which appears to me to be the same as the lines, as the district line that separates House District 114 and 150.
Sure.
Does that appear to be correct to you?
It does.
So would you agree then that the boundary of precinct 66.1 tracks the boundary in your map in Plaintiff's Exhibit 328 between House District 114 and 150?
I would agree with that. I would also agree that that there's no reason that it needs to stop at that VTD line. Obviously, there's a lot of VTDs that get put into a district. But yes, I would grant you that that follows the contour of that VTD.
Well, how do you know that the district doesn't need to stop at that line? How do you know that for population purposes, you couldn't put any more precincts into that district?
You would have to subtract something out. Again, there's two sides of this fraction, right? And I find it hard to believe that it was so locked in place that that exact division had to take place.
All right. Now, do you know if the House District boundaries that you said, do you remember pointing out House District boundaries that divided the campus of East Carolina University?
I do.
Okay. Do you know if that House District boundary also tracked precinct lines?
I do not.
Okay. That's not something you looked at for any of the colleges that you pointed out that were divided between House districts in the report?
I did not do an analysis of the borders of those specific VTDs. Also don't understand how that would possibly take away any conclusion about partisan effects. Again, there's no one VTD that has to be tagged to a certain district.
All right. Well, that's true insofar as, unless you had to include or exclude VTD for population purposes, right?
Again, a single VTD would not have to ever be included in one district versus the other. If you add one, you subtract another. It's two sides of the fraction.
Well, that's not really true though, is it, Dr. Cooper? Because different VTDs have different populations, don't they?
Sure.
So if you subtract one, you might have to add 2 or 3. It's not a one-to-one substitution.
I didn't say it was a one-to-one. I said it was a fraction.
Okay. Well, maybe I just misunderstood what you were saying there. All right, why don't we turn then, I think we've covered that topic. Why don't we turn into the Hoffler maps?
Okay.
And, you know, you used the traffic light analogy several times yesterday and today with the Hoffler maps. But that analogy only applied, I think you suggested that green, I don't know if it's green, it's more like a chartreuse perhaps. But green, we'll call it green and red. The red meant stop for Democrats and the green meant go for Republicans. But that analogy only works for one set of maps, right? That's only true for the Senate maps, is that right?
Yes, I was not offering that Dr. Hoffler thought of it like a traffic light. I was offering that was a way to help us understand what he saw on the screen and to translate this red-blue to this other, would you call it, what was the color you had? Green? Chartreuse to the chartreuse color scheme.
Okay, all right. So Dr. Hoffler changed that up though between the Senate and the House. Is that right?
That's correct.
Different color schemes. And you didn't find any kind of key in Dr. Hoffler's files that explained what the color scheme meant, did you?
No, absolutely. On the left side of each one of those screens, it said what each color represented.
Well, I asked you a bad question there. You didn't find anything in Dr. Hoffler's files that explained why he chose the colors that he did you?
Yeah, there was no chartreuse code.
Okay, all right. That's
Nothing that said, here's why I chose this particular colored ramp.
Okay, all right, thank you. Now the files that you looked at from the devices that were taken from Dr. Hoffler's home after his death, those were the files that counsel told you to look at, right?
Counsel gave me certain files and asked me to inspect them. I did not have access to the hard drive.
So you didn't personally search any of the files on Dr. Hoffler's computer, did you?
No, I've never seen or touched Dr. Hoffler's computer, if that's the question.
All right. Well, and you didn't have a chance to search through all of his files either, did you?
I don't think anybody would want me searching through all of his files.
And you didn't have a chance to search through all of his maps, did you?
Every map on his hard drive? No.
All right. And you don't know what was on Dr. Hoffler's screen when he was deciding which VTDs to include in which districts, do you?
I know what was on Dr. Hoffler's screen when he saved those files, and I know the date that he saved those files.
But so that my question though was different. My question was, you don't know what was on his screen when he was deciding which VTDs to include in which districts, do you?
Yeah, and I was trying to answer your question, but answered in the affirmative with what I can tell you.
But when he was deciding whether to put precinct 66.1 in Buncombe County in District 114, you don't know what was on the screen when he was making that decision, do you?
I don't know what was in his mind, so I certainly don't know the correlation between his mind and his screen, but I know that what was on his screen runs strikingly similar, almost identical in most cases, to our actual district lines that had clear partisan consequences, and you can clearly see what he had knowledge of.
All right. And that's based upon what the screen looked like at the time he last saved it.
And the underlying data that it represented.
Okay. And so you tested, like, I'll strike that. In your report, you wrote that partisanship was Dr. Hoffler's overwhelming, if not sole motivation in drawing the districts featured in the screenshots that appear in the report. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the basis for that statement is the color coding of the DTDs that appear on the magnitude screenshots that you testified about. Is that right?
The basis for that statement is the combined partisan effects of those choices combined with what was on his screen when he saved it.
Now, isn't it true, Dr. Cooper, that in addition to being color-coded, each of the DTDs included in the screenshots in the report also contain population figures?
That is correct.
And you can't say how much of a factor population was versus partisanship in drawing into the maps you testified about earlier, can you?
I take it as a given that he wanted to equalize population within the parameters decided by the General Assembly. I don't think anybody's questioning that there's unequal population in any of these districts, either proposed or drawn.
Now, you would agree that in drawing the maps that were found on devices in his house after his death, Dr. Hoffler would have been constrained in how he used partisanship data by the, well, I think you may answer the question. The equal population requirement would have constrained how he used partisanship data.
I think he had to meet the equal population requirement.
Okay, I think we're agreed on that. Now, you would agree that in drawing the maps that were found on his devices, Dr. Hoffler would have been constrained by the county grouping requirements.
I'm taking as faith that he both needed to equalize population, and he obviously operated within the county groupings.
You didn't see any county grouping requirement violations in the maps that you reviewed for this article, right?
No, I did not.
Now, you also found no evidence in any of the files that you reviewed for Dr. Hoffler's home that any copies of those maps were provided to members of the North Carolina General Assembly. Is that right?
No. That is correct. I did not find that.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 330. And looking at Plaintiff's Exhibit 330, I believe I understood your testimony earlier today to be that the formula that's included in this formula box was the formula that you believe Dr. Hoffler used to create the thematic colors that were included in the NC Senate J24 map. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And I believe that you said in your report that that plan was last saved on July 5th of 2017. Is that right?
I'd have to see the properties file to remember, but I'll take that as true.
Okay. And I believe that you testified, at least in the deposition, that you believe that this plan was initially backed up around June 24th of 2017 because of the file name. Is that right? The fact that it was named the J24 plan.
I don't remember the date from the deposition. I think the properties file that we reviewed lists the date it was created and the date it was saved, and I would go by that.
But it's your contention that this file was created in June of 2017.
Again, you have to put the properties field up, or at least give me the exhibit number to review that, but
Okay. Now, I think in your rebuttal report, I think it's Exhibit 329. Turn to the page. Now, I'm getting that from, it's page 5, footnote 6. I believe that's where you stated the date that the plan was last saved.
Okay.
I'm not sure that you discussed the date that it was created, but what, did you attach any significance to the J-24 being in the title of the plan?
No, he had, it was the name of the plan. Like sometimes, one time he called New Raleigh. I don't know why he called that one New Raleigh, for example.
You don't know what the word J-24 means?
I don't. I know from the properties when the file was created, when the file was saved. That's what I know.
Okay, all right. Now, in looking at this formula, I understand that it's your contention this formula contains election data from 9 different races that are between 2008 and 2014. Is that right?
As indicated in the Microsoft Word file that he had with the code that's on page 6 of my second expert report.
On page 6 of your rebuttal report, that's where you list the races that you believe were included in that index, right?
That's where I list the races that he had listed on the Word file as included.
All right. And looking at that list of races and then looking at the races that are listed in that formula box, I don't see any election data from 2016 included. Is that right?
That's correct.
And let's turn then to Plaintiff's Exhibit 337. Now, Plaintiff's Exhibit 337, I understood you to testify that this is the formula you believe Dr. Hoffler used to create the thematic colors for the NC House J25 plan. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And I understood your testimony to be that this formula contains election data using the same 9 races that were used to create the thematic colors for the Senate plan we just looked at. Is that right?
I believe that is correct.
All right. And as with the Senate plan, no election data from 2016 was included. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, you've said several times that you believe that, I think your counsel's used this phrase too, that Dr. Hoffler used political or partisan data with surgical precision. Is that right?
Okay.
Is it your test? Is that, I mean, that is what your testimony was? Is that right?
I've said those words, yes.
All right. And is it your contention that Dr. Hoffler used partisan data with surgical precision, even though he used stale elections data?
I wouldn't call those stale election data.
You don't think it would be relevant to have 2016 elections data and an after drawing in 2017?
I don't know. I think 2016, as we'll all attest, was a bit of an unusual year in American politics. I don't know what he was thinking or why he decided to create the formula. It maps on extraordinarily well to the data that I presented from 2016 and the Attorney General's election. I have no opinion on why he chose those elections other than it was clearly a partisan formula.
Well, he didn't even have, he had one race from 2014, right?
He had one race from 2014.
And half of the races were from 2008, 4 of them. Close to half.
Are you wanting me to defend Dr. Hoffler's formula?
No, I'm just asking. Do you find that unusual that if you're making contention that he's using partisan data, using it with surgical precision, that he didn't include more recent elections data than that?
Maybe he didn't have them in the right form. I have no idea.
Okay. Now, we pulled up an exhibit this morning that I wanted to ask you a question about. It's Plaintiff's Exhibit 566. I'll wait for you to get done. Sorry.
Yep. I got you. Go ahead.
Okay. In looking at Plaintiff's Exhibit 566,
you testified about the fact that there was a date created and a date last modified. I think you mentioned that this file was created July 11th, 2011. I think you said 1:13 in the morning. Is that right?
I believe so.
And then it says date last modified, July 11th, 2011, at 1:19 in the morning. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, there's only a 6-minute gap between those two numbers.
That's true.
Can you explain why that is?
I was not in the room with him at any point, much less at 1:13 in the morning on July 11th, 2011. But it appears pretty clear that he copied this from North Carolina Senate July 9th, that he had this other map file. He created it, he messed with it, played with it, analyzed it, looked at it, had it on the screen while he went to walk his dog, something for a few minutes, and then he saved it at 1:19.
Now, is it your contention that he drew this map in 6 minutes?
No, it's my contention that he clearly copied it from a previous map. Like if I have a letter of recommendation for a student, I might start from an old letter of recommendation. Please don't tell my students.
Okay. All right. So when you say he copied it from a previous map, you're referring to the comments box, is that right?
I am.
Okay, so you're saying that what he did at 1:13 in the morning on July 11th, 2011, he copied this map from a map called NC Senate July 9th, and then he saved it 6 minutes later, worked on it, saved it 6 minutes later? Is that right?
I don't know whether he worked on it. I don't know whether went and walked his dog. I don't know what he did. I know that he created this file on June 11, 2011 at 1:13 in the morning and 22 seconds. This was a file that he had copied from a previous file that he had called North Carolina Senate July 9th, and that he then he saved it at 1:19 in the morning, 6 minutes later, and 22 seconds.
Well, that's a good point, Dr. Cooper. You don't know what happened between 1:13 in the morning this thing was created and 1:19 when it was last modified. You don't know what happened between those 2 times. You don't know whether Dr. Hopper did anything with this map during those 6 minutes.
I know that he created it, and I know that he modified it, or that he saved it, and that he copied it from another file. That's all I know.
And that's all you could say about any of the maps, right? When you look at the date created and the date modified. You can't say what, if anything, Dr. Hopper did between the date and time that the file was created and the date and time it was modified.
I don't know what Dr. Hoffler did. I know that he had partisanship down to the VTD level. I know that he had these formulas. I know the formula was McCain vote essentially in 2011, and that it was a slightly more complicated formula in 2017. I know when each file was created. I know when each file was last saved, and I know the lineage of those files.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. I have no further questions for you this time.
Mr. Branch, questions?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Cox? Redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You may step down. Further evidence for the plaintiff?
Plaintiffs will call Dr. Jonathan Madden, who is right outside, will be in just one moment. Your Honors, Dr. Mattingly, for part of his presentation, for some of his figures, it will be useful for him to, if it's okay with you all, to step down into the well. He has a sort of old-fashioned pointer that he'll use to direct your attention to the screen.
That will be fine, and then just make sure to keep the voice up so the court reporter and all in the courtroom can hear.
He's a professor, so he's able to project.
You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Sorry, for a moment. I'm just gonna get a exhibit binder.
Of course.
So. Be careful with how fast you speak. If you're your class, and if you could just give a 1-second pause between the question and answer, it would help me not interrupt you.
I'll try very hard to do.
Exhibit here for you.
Thank you.
Very good. You ready, Ms. Steele?
I am, yes. And I've got Dr. Mattingly's exhibit binder with his report and various exhibits. And the version of the report that I've given him has some notes from him, and has a couple of notes from him in it. And we had a copy of that for the defendants, the version with the notes that I can't find right now, but if they're minor notes, and we'll give them to you later on. Dr. Mattingly, could you state your full name, please?
Jonathan Christopher Mattingly.
And how are you currently employed?
I am a professor of mathematics in the chair of the mathematics department at Duke University.
And do you have any other title in the math department?
I'm the James B. Duke Professor of Mathematics.
And do you hold a faculty appointment in any other department at Duke?
I'm also a professor in the Department of Statistical Science.
And did you grow up in North Carolina?
I did. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I went to high school at the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham.
And can you tell us about your educational background post-high school?
I did my undergraduate work at Yale, where I received a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics with a concentration in physics. Then I went overseas to study at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, France, where I studied statistical physics. And then I returned to the US to study at Princeton University, where I received a PhD in applied and computational mathematics.
And did you hold any other academic positions between receiving your PhD and coming to Duke?
I spent 4 years at Stanford University as an assistant professor, and then I spent 1 year in between before returning to Duke at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey.
And do you have particular areas of specialization as a professor of math and statistics at Duke?
Yes, applied mathematics and computational statistics probability.
And what is applied mathematics?
It's the discipline that tries to study the world around us using mathematics and using mathematical modeling.
And can you provide some examples of how you've used applied math to study the world around us?
Some examples are, for instance, I've studied water flow, turbulent water flow. I've studied biochemical networks. I've modeled computational methods that are used in molecular dynamics, like protein folding simulations.
And can you describe some of the recent courses that you've taught?
I apologize, just launching my ship. Yes, I've taught courses in probability and stochastic analysis. I taught a course in quantifying gerrymandering this last year. Statistics, information theory, things like that.
And can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 360? Is this a true and accurate copy of your CV as of April 2019, including your publications and the academic positions that you held?
Yes, it is.
Except that since you submitted the CV, you received a new title as the James B. Duke Professor of Mathematics.
That is correct.
And how many publications have you authored in peer-reviewed journals?
Over 50.
And aside from being chair of the Duke Math Department, have you received other honors in the field of mathematics?
Yes, I was a National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator. I'm a fellow of the American Mathematical Society. I'm a fellow of the Institute for Mathematical Sciences.
At this time, the plaintiff's tender, Dr. Mattingly is an expert in the fields of applied mathematics, statistical science, and probability.
I didn't read that.
Sure, sorry about that.
Dr. Mattingly as what?
As an expert in the fields of applied mathematics, statistical science, and probability.
Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Branch? Mr. Cox? No objection. Very well. His testimony will be received as well.
Thank you. Dr. Mattingly, tell us about how you became interested in studying partisan gerrymandering.
In 2013, I had an undergraduate student, Christy Vaughn, a fellow North Carolinian, who was particularly interested in politics, mathematics, their intersection, just modeling, things like that in general. We were looking for a project over a summer, and at that moment, the people were talking a lot around the 2012 the Congressional House of Representatives election. There was a lot of talk because the vote was essentially split, slightly Democratic majority favor statewide. The fact that the Republicans had won 9 seats and the Democrats had only won 4 seats was somehow not what was expected. And that got us rather curious because it wasn't so clear to me exactly what should be expected, because we don't work in a proportional representation system, and North Carolina has a strange shape, and it's people live in different corners, and cities are in different corners, and so we wanted to understand what the effect of the shape of North Carolina and its geopolitical geography was on that outcome, to understand if it was strange.
And did you start a project at Duke called Quantifying Gerrymandering?
I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
It's been a project that's run for a number of years. It has had undergraduate students initially that have worked on a lot of different projects looking at different states, different questions, and then has had some graduate students and postdocs come into it along the way.
And how do you analyze partisan gerrymandering for purposes of your Quantifying Gerrymandering academic project?
The basic idea is that we select some nonpartisan redistricting criteria, and then we generate a large collection, an ensemble, I usually call it, an ensemble of maps. An ensemble? I'd spell it for you, but I'm borderline dyslexic. And so we take that ensemble, this collection of maps, and we ask if we take some historical elections and we evaluate how this nonpartisan collection would behave, how does that compare to a particular map of interest? And we look at lots of different dimensions in that analysis.
And is your Quantifying Gerrymandering project at Duke related to Tom Ross's project?
No, we had started this before Tom Ross, but when he came to Duke as a lecturer in the Sanford School for Public Policy, he was starting this simulation of a nonpartisan redistricting, a bipartisan, I should say, redistricting commission made of former judges, retired judges, I guess is the right word. And he was told of my work, and he asked me if I would be interested in helping to evaluate the maps that the judges produced.
And excuse me, have you written academic papers describing your method of analyzing partisan bias in an actual map by comparing it to the universe of nonpartisan maps?
I've written a number, yes, I have.
One of those is Quantifying Gerrymandering in North Carolina.
Yes.
And is one Quantifying Gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering in Wisconsin?
It is.
And did you testify in 2017 on behalf of Common Cause in the federal court partisan gerrymandering challenge to North Carolina's congressional districts?
Yes, that grew out of my work with Tom Ross. Common Cause heard me give a talk, and then they asked me to present my work in that case.
And did you then become interested in analyzing North Carolina's legislative districts?
Yes.
Did that start as an academic project?
It did.
And then counsel for plaintiffs asked you to serve as an expert witness in this case?
Correct.
And did the plaintiffs ask you to evaluate whether there was partisan bias in the 2017 plans and whether that was intentional?
Yes, they did.
And is the approach you're going to testify about today the same approach that you've developed for purposes of your academic research efforts?
It is. It's the natural continuation of that line of research.
And Dr. Mattingly, why did you decide to serve as an expert witness in this case?
Well, I'm a North Carolinian, so I have an interest in our government running well, I think. That's the main reason. To be honest, there's also the fact that academics like to talk about things that they're proud of and that they think that they like, so they always say yes.
And Your Honors, so we have a slide deck that we prepared with Dr. Mattingly and that he'd like to use to walk through his report and his expert conclusions. And with the court's permission, he'd like to step down from the stand and do that closer to the screen. Would that be all right?
Thank you, sir. Just be sure to keep your voice up.
Yes, please. Please let me know. I'll try to use my best loud voice. I haven't quite heard it before either. Excuse me. I'm just gonna get my water. What if I put it there as a mic? I'll put it here.
Doctors, that microphone does not work for any
Oh, I see. Got it. All right, I'll try to speak with my loudest professor voice.
All right, can we flip to the next slide? Dr. Mattingly, so before we get into the details, can you tell us broadly what you concluded in your expert report?
Yes, so I looked at the 2017 North Carolina House and Senate maps, and I saw that they displayed a systematic, persistent bias towards the Republican Party, both on the statewide level and on the county cluster level. I saw that these maps were an extreme partisan outlier when compared to what we would have expected from a nonpartisan collection of maps, and specifically a collection of maps that respected the political geography of the state. The extreme partisan bias in the 2017 plans is durable, persistent across a broad range of different North Carolina elections, historic election voting patterns. The gerrymander is particularly effective when the Republicans are in danger, or when the Democrats are threatening to break either the Republican supermajority or a Republican majority. And lastly, the chance of choosing such a map without intentionally looking for it among this collection of maps that I had was astronomically small.
Dr. Mattingly, when you refer to something throughout your testimony as a partisan gerrymander or showing partisan bias, what do you mean by that?
Well, I start from the definition of what it means to gerrymander. In my mind, what it means to gerrymander is to change the boundaries of districts to favor one party politically, or yeah, basically, that's what a political gerrymander is, at least. And when I hear that definition, it immediately raises to the mathematician mind in me, well, you said change. Change from what? Right? If I'm going to see that something has changed from something else, I need to have some idea of what it would have been before you changed it. And so this entire enterprise, this entire project started from that question in the congressional districts, and now we're just going to continue to apply that idea here.
Okay. And so can you just give us a high-level overview of the methodology that you employed in this case to assess partisan bias in the 2017 state House and Senate plans?
So I've already kind of alluded to it, but let me flesh it out a bit more. So the idea is we create this nonpartisan collection of maps, and we do that having selected a number of particular dimensions, nonpartisan dimensions that we want our maps to have. Then we take that collection of maps and we take particular historical elections which are given to us at the precinct level, and we look at each of our nonpartisan maps we've created, redistricting maps, and we ask what would be the partisan outcome under that map, and what would be its margins of victory and other questions of interest. And then we do that for each and every map we have, and that gives us an idea, a distribution, a baseline with which to compare another map that someone hands to us.
Go to the next slide. Dr. Mattingly, how many plans did you generate for each legislative chamber?
So for the House, I generated about 10 to the 100 maps, and for the Senate, about 10 to the 93 maps. So yeah, 10 to the 100 is 10 with 100 zeros afterwards.
And 10 to the 14th is 100 trillion, is that about right?
10 to the 14th, I think, is 100 trillion, yes.
So this is a lot more than 100 trillion.
Yeah, I mean, if you look it up in popular press, they'll say this is more than what we think the number of atoms are in the known universe.
So let's walk through more specifically how you generated the maps and the constraints that apply. So can you tell us first generally how you generate the maps in your collection of nonpartisan maps?
Well, we use a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm, and that's a computer algorithm which is used to generate the maps, to draw from a nonpartisan collection of maps. And we designed that collection. These are particular dimensions that we're interested in, so I'll read them off. County clusters, preserving county clusters, population, equality, contiguity, compactness, preserving municipalities and precincts/VTDs. And that's how we generate.
So did you ensure that the maps in your collection were similar to the enacted plans with respect to these nonpartisan traditional criteria?
Yes, that's the main idea, is that we try to tune our ensemble of maps to be similar in these nonpartisan criteria to the map we're thinking about, to the map we're looking at. Or if there's no map, the generally accepted criteria.
And Dr. Mattingly, you were here for part of Dr. Chen's testimony, correct?
Yes, for part of it.
And do you recall that we heard from Dr. Chen on Tuesday that when he was creating his computer-generated maps, one of the things he was doing was prioritizing traditional redistricting criteria?
Yes.
Are you prioritizing or optimizing or maximizing those criteria?
No, I'm not. I'm creating maps that have a distribution in these different dimensions that is around, similar on either side of the enacted map. Excuse me.
And just going back to the criteria listed on the slide, do all of the maps in your collection respect the county clusters that the legislature chose for the enacted plans?
Yes, they do.
And if a specific county within a cluster was kept whole in the enacted plans, do the maps in your collection keep that county whole?
Yes, they do.
And did you also ensure that the number of county traversals in each map was similar to the number of county traversals in the enacted maps?
Yes, we also controlled for that.
And generally, did you ensure population equality within 5% of the ideal population?
Yes, we generally did that.
And we'll come back to this, but in the few instances where you didn't, did you conduct a new analysis to correct for that issue?
Yeah, yes, we did.
All the maps respect contiguity?
Yes.
All similar in terms of compactness to the enacted plan?
Yes.
All similar along municipality and precinct splits?
Yes.
And then you froze the districts that had been drawn by the special master in the Covington litigation?
Yes, I did.
So why did you pick these particular criteria?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, these are largely the traditional redistricting criteria, nonpartisan redistricting criteria that one usually sees. We did also look at the categories, the instructions given by the legislature for making the 2017 map. But once we had the general dimensions, the general criterias, we then looked at the actual enacted map to key off how we would interpret those.
So we haven't yet talked about protecting incumbents. Did you initially program the computer to ensure that no incumbents were paired in your map?
No, I mean, from my perspective, incumbency is a partisan criteria, so we initially did not respect incumbency.
Did you consider the potential impact of incumbency later on?
Yeah, we did a secondary analysis where we did consider incumbency.
And did you find that avoiding pairing incumbents made any difference to your conclusion that the 2017 plans were extreme gerrymanders?
No, it didn't change any of our qualitative conclusions.
Dr. Mattingly, are you confident that the collection of hundreds of trillions of maps that you generated was representative of the possible redistricting maps of North Carolina that are similar to the enacted plan along these nonpartisan criteria?
Yes, in designing our Monte Carlo algorithm, we employed certain well-established statistical tests within that algorithm to help make sure that we were getting a representative sample.
And is this algorithm something that you came up with yourself?
Markov chain Monte Carlo? No, this is a long Markov chain. Should I just say MCMC? Would that be better? MCMC from now on means Markov chain Monte Carlo. So if the MCMC algorithm is a well-established tool, it dates back to at least the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, the National Labs in Los Alamos, but it's also used in hurricane forecasting, in drug design, and computational genetics. I mean, to be honest, a large fraction of the statisticians in the Duke Statistics Department use this as their main tool.
All right, so from the perspective of your expertise in applied math and probability, why does this approach of generating a representative sample of hundreds of trillions of nonpartisan maps make sense as a tool to examine partisan gerrymandering?
Well, like I said before, I mean, you could say I'm going to decide that everything should be proportionality and care about that, or I should come up with some other idea of fairness in the abstract. But given that our system has decided that we're going to have local representation, and that local representation is going to, give preference to districtings that are good in these dimensions, then maybe we should. So what this does, the reason I like it, is that it says we'll take those inputs, those values, and then we'll use them to directly translate to discover what would have happened if we had only used these criteria.
Does it allow you to isolate the effect of partisan criteria?
Yes, it does. So for instance, when you say isolate, you probably mean that it naturally, the baseline that I'm going to build naturally builds in the effects of things like natural packing of different groups in different areas, the differences between the East and the West, the weird shape of our state that it becomes a little wedge at one end and that we have intervening waters here and there. I mean, all of that is built in from the very beginning. And any deviation we see from that is something on top of what could be explained directly from only those concepts.
So everything you're going to testify about today already incorporates any bias based on natural packing?
Yes.
All right, let's turn to how you analyzed the partisan bias in the 2017 plans compared to your collection of nonpartisan maps. And can you again describe your approach at a high level?
Right, so I mean, just slightly repeating what I said before, but with a little more detail. So we're going to take a particular map that we generate using our MCMC algorithm, Markov chain Monte Carlo. That was for them, not for and then we'll take a particular election, pick your favorite election, and that gives you vote counts at the precinct by precinct level. You then take that precinct by precinct vote count and you take each district in your plan and you add up the votes, Democrat, Republican, and you decide who won that district. And then you tabulate those statistics over many, many maps.
And then you compare that to the enacted map?
Yes, I do.
You go to the next slide. So how many, excuse me, how many historical elections did you use for purposes of your analysis in this case?
So I used these 17 elections that are on this slide. And the reason I picked those historical elections was that I was particularly interested in, well, first of all, I just picked all the elections, all the major elections since 2008 up to when I'd written the report. And I wanted both the major elections, but I also wanted a nice distribution of partisan outcomes. So this other column here gives the Democratic vote share statewide. And so but I didn't just care about that. I also wanted a couple, especially in this intermediate zone around an even split, because different elections have different spatial structures. Just because they have the same statewide partisan makeup doesn't mean they're the same election. They have a very different geographical structure.
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by different spatial structure?
Well, I mean, some elections, the suburbs vote with the center city, and sometimes the suburbs don't. Sometimes the East votes with the West. Sometimes, sometimes Raleigh agrees with Charlotte, right? I mean, there are different elections that have very different structure from year to year, and that structure is captured by different elections. These are actual North Carolina elections.
And Dr. Mattingly, for your analysis of the congressional districts in the Rucho case, you used results from congressional elections to compare your collection, your ensemble of nonpartisan maps to the enacted plan. Why didn't you use the actual results of legislative elections here? Why did you only use statewide elections?
So over time, I've come to feel that it's much better to use statewide elections. The elections based on the actual districts you're supposed to study are much more corrupted by the actual shape of the districts. There's different turnouts in different races. There's stronger, weaker candidates. There's often unopposed candidates. There's a lot of things you have to deal with, where if you look at a statewide election, it's much less of an issue. That's all kind of taken care of. And you can then just use different elections to talk about weaker, stronger candidates across the whole state. Yes?
And are there sometimes unopposed elections in legislative races?
Elections. Yeah.
I said, are there sometimes unopposed elections in legislative races? Does that make it more difficult to use legislative elections to analyze sort of partisan outcomes of a statewide map?
Yeah, so I mean, and especially if you're talking, when you say legislative, if you mean state legislature as opposed to federal legislature. The state legislature, those districts are even smaller, right? And there's many, many more races, and so those variation across districts becomes much broader, and the effect on the local vote count becomes much more pronounced.
Okay. So let's shift gears to how exactly you take the votes from the historical elections and use them to analyze your collection of maps. We flip to the next slide. So tell us what this is.
So, well, this is the state of North Carolina. The dark black lines are the different county clusters. So each of the different county clusters. And then each of the very fine lines are all the precinct lines. So each of the so we get votes on the level of our precincts here.
And then how do you analyze the democratic performance of various districts in the map? Go to the next slide, maybe.
So here I've just created a fictitious redistricting of this county cluster into 3 districts. And so what I would do is I would take one of these districts, the blue one, for instance, and I would add up precinct by precinct by precinct the vote count in each of the precincts. I would take the vote count in each precinct, add it up over that district to get a district-wide vote count. And that would then tell me who won that district and by what margin, what the partisan advantage was. And then I do that across every one of my districts. So a full map would have every district colored. I just wanted to keep it cleaner for you. And then I would use that to build an understanding of what one would typically see under that vote count.
Under the vote count from a particular historical election?
For, the governor race in 2012.
And did you hear Dr. Chen testify about summing up election results?
Yes, he did. I recall him saying that.
And you're doing a form of analysis that's a little bit different, is that right?
Well, only in that I tend to use single elections and a large number of them. Like I said, each election corresponds to a different spatial pattern of voting. And so if you thought that a certain mixture of elections created a more interesting spatial pattern of voting that you might be interested in, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing. I remember in the Rucho case, Dr. Hoffler did the same thing because he had a particular idea of what he wanted, presumably.
But you're comparing, in general, election by election?
Yes, election by election.
Okay, and let's flip to the next slide. So one thing that you do is compare the number of seats that each party would win under the enacted plan to the number of seats that the party would win under your nonpartisan maps across all 17 elections?
Yes.
Are you only looking at seats?
No, I look at the seat count. That's an obvious first thing you would look at. Anyone would look at that first. But we'll see that it's really important to understand the structure of the election. So I also look at the margins of victory, which will give me insight into how the map behaves as we get close to breaking the majority, or how it would behave as we get close to breaking the supermajority. And also it'll let me identify districts that have been cracked or packed. So cracked means you put more voters into a particular group of districts to dilute their political power, or cracking is just the opposite. You spread voters out more to dilute their political power.
And do the margins of victory tell you something about the structure of the map?
I'm sorry, I was drinking. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Do the margins of victory tell you something about the structure of the map?
Yes, they really do. I mean, they give a lot of insight into the structure. I mean, I don't just want to identify whether a seat count is an outlier, but I want to understand the structure of the map and understand how that builds or doesn't build a potential gerrymander.
And if you could just try to go a little bit more slowly, and I will try to do the same.
Sorry.
And why do you look at majority and supermajority representation?
Well, those are of particular political interest. I mean, those are, qualitative features of a map. Qualitative features of a map, which are really important for how that map acts inside the political system.
And the final bullet on the slide there is outlier analysis. What does that mean?
Right, so outlier analysis is really talking about everything above it. It's saying not only, in particular, whenever I investigate any of these questions, I want to give an answer about how often we would have seen that typically in our collection of maps. Was it an outlier? So somehow there's a distribution, there's what typically happens, and an outlier is literally something out in left field, or right field, but away from what typically happens.
All right. And does your analysis include any assumptions about proportional representation?
No, that's the entire point. If we were going to assume proportional representation, we would just take the statewide vote fraction and figure out how many seats that gave you. All this wouldn't be necessary.
All right. We'll see that visually a little bit later on. Let's turn to your results. Can we do the next slide? So this is Plaintiff's Exhibit 361, which is an example of your analysis just focusing on the Senate using the votes from the Lieutenant Governor 2008 election. Can you sort of walk us through this figure, starting with the horizontal axis?
Yeah, so this is called a histogram, and let me explain what's on here.
And just try to go a little bit more slowly.
Yes. All right, so there's the horizontal line, this axis here, and that's labeled with seat count. So we're talking about the Senate. So there's 0 to 50 seats in the Senate, and we're talking about how many seats did the Democratic Party win using the actual votes, precinct by precinct votes in Lieutenant Governor 08 election. So I have those votes at the precinct level. I take each map in my ensemble, and I calculate how many seats did the Democratic Party win statewide. Of course, I get that number for each and every map that I have, and I keep track of how many times do I get 25 seats, how many times do I get 26 seats, and I represent that in this blue histogram, whose height, so the height above 25, as you see if I go in straight, I think goes to there. That height, if we read over onto the vertical axis, gives the percentage of the maps that have that property. So approximately, I don't know, I'm eyeballing it, 27% of the maps elect 25 Democrats in the Senate. So it gives us a range of what will happen if we pick a nonpartisan map. I'm not trying to say, do this is what happened. I'm trying to give a range of what one would typically see.
Okay, can you go to the next slide? What does the enacted marker represent?
Right, so as I've already discussed, the entire point of this exercise is to compare this distribution of what would be expected under a nonpartisan collection of maps to what would happen for a particular map. The map of interest today is the 2017 enacted map, which henceforth I'll just label with enacted. And so what this shows is what the outcome for that enacted map was. And so the enacted map elected 25, 24, 23 Democrats. And we see that that happened in about 1 to 2%. I think it's about 1.5% of our huge ensemble. So it was not particularly typical.
It was an outlier.
It was an outlier, yes.
And is the seat deviation you see here, I think it's about 2 to 3 seats, is that significant in the context of the North Carolina Senate?
Well, I think 3 seat deviation from 23 moves you across the majority line, so I suspect that people who work in the Senate would find that a significant change.
All right, so let's go to the next slide. And this is a portion of Plaintiff's Exhibit 362, which is Figure 2 from Dr. Mattingly's report. And we're starting with just a portion so that Dr. Mattingly can walk the court through how to read it. So first, can you explain the relationship between this slide with lots of blue histograms and the prior slide we saw with just the one blue histogram?
Yes. I think it was LG08, the previous slide?
Yes.
Yes, I couldn't remember. Thank you. So this is just mini, first of all, let's start. Many of these blue histograms are just mini versions of what we saw in the previous slide. In particular, we were just looking at LG08. Now, the scale is a little different because I wanted to put a whole bunch of them on this plot at once, so I've compressed the vertical scale a little bit to make it visible. However, what you see here is, again, on the horizontal line, I have the number of seats of Democrats elected. I've now truncated it, so it starts at 10 and stops at 35, since we don't really go beyond that ever. And now what I've shown is the histogram giving the frequency of different partisan outcomes, as say the number of seats elected to the Democratic Party, typically under our nonpartisan election for a collection for, I believe, 13 different elections. So we have governor 2012, and the thing to notice is that in the parentheses here are the statewide Democratic vote fraction. So I've also ordered these different elections top to bottom, at the bottom being the more Republican elections, and at the top being the more Democrat elections. So the vertical axis is actually the statewide vote fraction. And so you see here I have governor 12, LG 16, lieutenant governor. I have US Senate 16. I have president 16, president 12, US Senate, I'm just trying to hit the ones you haven't seen yet, attorney general 16, commissioner of insurance 12, US Senate 08. That's just, I named a few of the ones on the slide.
So if the districts were drawn here in the Senate without reference to partisan data, where on these blue histograms would you expect the election results to fall?
Well, these histograms give what outcomes, what seat totals were seen the most frequently in our nonpartisan ensemble. So they give that answer. And so typically we would expect to see them in the meaty part, in the fat part of this blue histogram. So following my pointer up. And I'm just moving top to bottom, touching the center of each of these big blue districts.
So the
big blue histogram, sorry.
The tallest part of the histogram is
Yes.
where you would expect the result to fall?
That was a good word. The tallest part. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide. And what have we done now?
Well, since the point of this exercise is to compare what we would typically see under a nonpartisan collection of maps to what we actually saw in the enacted map using the same elections, going election by election by election, what we've added on is the purple dots here. So the purple dots show the outcome, that is to say how many Democrats were elected under the enacted map from 2017 in each one of the elections. And so, for instance, if you just follow this down, you get an idea, you see what that set of votes would have elected under the enacted map, so 21. And the thing to notice here is that for a large number of these plots, the purple dots fall far to the left. So they fall quite outside the tall parts, or even the not so tall parts of the blue histogram, or even where it's blue at all. And that's what we mean by an outlier. An outlier literally is a term that says it lies far outside of where this distribution said it should.
And if the if it's a pro-Republican outlier, is the purple dot to the left of the blue histogram?
Yes.
And if it's a pro-Democrat outlier,
Right.
it's to the right?
So there are clearly some that tilt. This one is not an outlier, it doesn't go as far, but it definitely tilts to the Democratic Party in that election.
You were pointing to the GB12.
Yes, sorry, governor 2012 election. Which is not surprising. You notice that not the tilt, but the fact, one thing to notice is that as the statewide percentage for the Democrats increase, not surprisingly, the histograms march to the right, which means more and more seats are elected for the Democrats.
Okay. Which elections on this histogram show the enacted map to be a pro-Republican outlier?
What you're asking me is just to look at each of these blue histograms and see when this purple dot is far outside of this histogram and to the left. So I'll name them. Commissioner of Insurance 08, Lieutenant Governor 08, Commissioner of Insurance 2012, Attorney General 16, Lieutenant Governor 12, U.S. Senate 14, President 12, President 16, U.S. Senate 16, Lieutenant Governor 16.
And does this analysis show then a systematic bias towards a particular party?
Yes, systematic bias towards the Republican Party, especially in this center regime, in the center region of the plot, which is centered around, well, which includes the 50% mark. Here's the 50% mark, right? These two elections saddled 50%.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So now we've added 3 vertical lines. Can you tell us what these 3 vertical lines represent?
Sorry. These 3 vertical lines help us understand which part of this plot there's a supermajority for one party, and at what point in this plot does the majority switch sides. So if you're to the left of this line that's labeled supermajority, that is, say, on this side, then the Republicans hold a supermajority. If you're to the right of this line labeled Democratic supermajority, the Democrats hold a supermajority. If you're in this region to the left, anywhere to the left of the half line, the halfway line, then it's a Republican majority, and anywhere to the right of this half line, it's a Democratic majority. So in particular, you can just look at a certain election and see whether the Republicans have a supermajority under that election using the enacted map, just by seeing if the dot falls on this side of the supermajority line or on this side of the halfway line, of the majority line.
All right, let's focus on the Republican supermajority line, the leftmost line.
That's this line here,
Yeah.
the one just between 20 and 21.
And does that fall right above 20 on the horizontal axis because the Democrats need to win more than 20 seats to break the Republican supermajority?
Yes, that's correct.
And so how does the enacted plan act in elections where Democrats get enough seats that you would expect them to break the Republican supermajority?
Well, the question you've asked me asks us to focus at these elections right here. So I'm focusing between PR 16 and AG 16. And what you see is that in many of these elections, there's a sizable part of the mass of this blue histogram that falls to the right of the supermajority line. And sometimes all of it does, for instance, in AG 16. Yet, in each and every one of those elections, the enacted plan, the purple dot for the enacted plan falls to the left of the supermajority, which means, quite plainly, that the enacted plan, the Republicans have a supermajority using that set of votes, and quite often, if not always, under the nonpartisan collection of maps in my ensemble, the Democrats would break that supermajority.
And focusing on the using the results of the AG 2016 election, which you focused on a few seconds ago, that's an election where the Democrats got 50.2% of the vote?
Yes, so it's close to a 50-50 split of the popular vote statewide.
And how many seats do the Democrats generally get in your hundreds of trillions of nonpartisan plans using that election?
So it looks like the tallest part here is 23, maybe a little bit on 24, and even a little bit less on 23.
And in the enacted plan, the supermajority for the Republicans is preserved?
Yes, they get 20 seats.
All right, and the figure we're looking at now doesn't quantify the extent to which the enacted plan is an outlier, but in your report, do you give the precise numbers underlying all of these histograms?
I do.
And under the Attorney General 2016 election, do your nonpartisan maps produce a Republican supermajority 0.001% of the time?
I totally lost you. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Go ahead. Start over.
Using the results of the Attorney General 2016 election, does your nonpartisan collection of maps produce a Republican supermajority 0.001% of the time?
Yes, it does.
And does that mean that the enacted map retains the Republican supermajority, even though the Democrats break it in 99.999% of the nonpartisan maps that you've created?
Yes, it does.
And do you conclude that this is an extreme pro-Republican partisan gerrymander?
Yes, I do.
All right, let's turn to the majority line. No, sorry, go back. Thanks. Does the enacted map have the same effect in preserving Republican majorities where the Republicans would lose the majority under nonpartisan plans?
Yes. If we look, for instance, at LG08 up to USS 08, Senate 08, we'll see that the large portion, if not all sometimes, oops, not 08, I went too high, sorry about that, right here. The largest part of the distribution is to the right of the halfway line. And we see that, for instance, in CI08, the purple dot is to the left. So this signifies a Republican majority, and all of this probability over here would be a Democratic majority.
Okay. Now, you only show 13 elections on this figure rather than all 17 that you analyzed, correct?
That is correct.
And why was that?
Well, for two reasons. One is that a few of the elections are way, way below or way above, and that would stretch out the plot too much to actually make it too useful. And in addition, there are other elections that fall essentially directly on top of some of the elections. And so we chose to just suppress them for visual clarity, although we give all of those numbers in the report.
Okay.
David, it's 1 o'clock.
We're going to break for lunch for 1 hour and we'll resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Here, recess until 2 o'clock.